Today on Brief History, we discuss one of the most famous queens of England and indeed the world. Overcoming many odds on her unlikely path to the throne, she would use the experiences of her past to defend her liberty and kingdom from foreign threats. Her time as queen would see elegant courtships, bloody reprisals, international strife, and the execution of a fellow sovereign queen. Join me as I take a brief look at the Virgin Queen, remembered today as Queen Elizabeth I of England. Elizabeth was born on September 7th, 1533 at Greenwich Palace near London. She was the daughter of King Henry VIII of England, and her mother was Anne Boleyn. Elizabeth would have two half-siblings, which will be discussed at length during her story: Mary, an elder half-sister, and Edward, a younger half-brother. Before discussing Elizabeth's childhood and youth, it is important to give a short synopsis of her backstory, specifically related to both her parents' marriage and religion. As we will see, both of these topics, marriage and religion, will become massively important topics in Elizabeth's later life. When discussing Elizabeth's parents, we must start by notating that Elizabeth's father was an incredible king, both in good and bad ways. He was both loved and feared in his time, and was fearless and frightening in his approach to dealing with the issues that he encountered. One of the biggest issues he faced was the fact that he was having a difficult time producing a male heir with his first wife, a former Spanish princess named Catherine of Aragon. England in the time of Elizabeth's father's reign had never had a woman rule in her own right, and thus, in his mind, it was imperative that he produced a son. After years of trying for children, Elizabeth's father and Catherine of Aragon would only produce one child, Elizabeth's half-sister Mary, discussed previously. Thus, as Catherine of Aragon aged, it became clear that she would not produce children. Elizabeth's father's eyes began to wander to other women, and one of those women was eventually to be Elizabeth's mother, Anne Boleyn. Unfortunately, due to Catherine of Aragon's international connections and limitations within Catholic doctrine, Elizabeth's father was unable to attain a divorce from the Pope. England was at the time still strictly Catholic, with Elizabeth's father being actually awarded the title of Defender of the Faith by the Pope during his reign. But Elizabeth's father was ruthless and would stop at nothing to achieve his goals. Incredibly, after failing to convince the Pope to provide him his desired divorce, he would break from Rome and the Catholic Church completely in a long and questionable process. Elizabeth's mother would become pregnant with her, and soon her father married her mother bigamously, before utilizing statutory law and Parliament to step by step make himself the ultimate supreme head of the Church of England. Elizabeth's father's marriage to Catherine of Aragon was finally deemed null and void, and soon Elizabeth's mother was crowned as queen. It should be noted that Elizabeth's mother, Anne, was known for her sympathies towards reformist, i.e. Protestant ideas, and thus was not particularly opposed to the religious changes that Elizabeth's father was implementing. In the end, Elizabeth's father would not be a true Catholic or a clearly defined Protestant. Instead, he existed somewhere in a middle ground where he was broken free from Rome and the Catholic Church, but maintained many of the Catholic traditions within his kingdom, to many Protestants' dismay. It was during this incredible and chaotic time of international religious scandal and dramatic marriage battles that Elizabeth was born. Of course, her sex was a dismay to her father, as he still required a male heir, and it was widely believed by many that Elizabeth would actually be a boy before she was born. Greenwich Palace was readied with a large and magnificent bed being installed for the delivery. Nevertheless, even though Elizabeth turned out to not be the sex that her father had hoped for, there was still time for her parents to produce a son and a male heir, and thus the attempts for children continued between her parents. Elizabeth was named after her grandmother, Elizabeth of York, and she was immediately declared as Princess of England, to the dismay of her stepsister Mary, who had the title stripped from her. Elizabeth spent the first few months of her life at Greenwich with her mother, but eventually was moved to Hatfield. There, she was joined by her now bastardized half-sister, the 17-year-old Mary, whose household had been absorbed by Elizabeth's. Mary had been stripped of her title of princess and did not take this demotion well. She became extremely difficult and confrontational, especially to Elizabeth and her mother. The relationship between Elizabeth and her sister, as we will soon see, would grow into an even more difficult one as they aged, despite short bouts of forced or hesitant reconciliations between the two. This negative relationship with her elder half-sister would be the source of much trouble in Elizabeth's future, which will be discussed in time. After Elizabeth's birth, Anne found it difficult to conceive, and thus when she miscarried pregnancies, Elizabeth's father began to realize that her mother would most likely not be able to produce the son he desired. The relationship between her parents had by that time began to sour, and her father was now beginning to see her mother as a liability. Therefore, it was easy for him to be convinced by Elizabeth's mother's enemies that she had been involved in adulterous relationships, including allegedly one with her brother. This was all certainly false, but Elizabeth's father's ruthless nature spurred him to seize the opportunity to rid him of his second wife. By 1536, Elizabeth's father was already eyeing another woman, specifically a woman named Jane Seymour, and with the miscarriages and accusations of adultery, Elizabeth's mother's fate was unfortunately sealed. She was condemned to death and beheaded at Tower Green when Elizabeth was only 2 years old. Elizabeth's father was soon married to Jane Seymour, who would eventually give birth to Elizabeth's half-brother, Prince Edward, but she would die due to the complications of the childbirth. Elizabeth's father would marry a total of 6 times throughout his life and execute another one of his wives in the same manner he executed Elizabeth's mother. Nevertheless, Prince Edward would be the last of Henry VIII's children. After her mother's downfall, Elizabeth, like her elder half-sister before her, was bastardized as well, although the king did acknowledge her as his daughter. As a result of these major changes, Elizabeth's home life became chaotic. Her household deteriorated into confusion, and many of those in the household became undisciplined and unruly. Elizabeth was even at one point short of clothing before the issues were finally addressed and remedied. In October 1537, Elizabeth attended her half-brother's christening, being carried by her brother's maternal uncle, a man named Edward Seymour. Edward Seymour and his brother, a man named Thomas Seymour, will come up again shortly. Elizabeth and her siblings were provided with an extensive education program, and it has been argued that Elizabeth was perhaps the most gifted with regard to her education. Her earliest lessons began with a new governess, a woman named Cat Ashley, but she also received instruction from her brother's tutors, Richard Cox and John Cheek, before having her own private tutor installed, a man named William Grindal. She would study and learn Latin, French, Italian, Greek, and some Spanish, but her early education was not specifically catered towards political understanding and problem solving, as she was not yet expected in that time to inherit the throne. Elizabeth's education was a success, and she delighted in her learning, so it was said. In 1543, Elizabeth's father married his 6th and final wife, a woman named Catherine Parr. Shortly thereafter, an act of succession was passed in Parliament, which reinstated both Elizabeth and her elder half-sister Mary to the succession. If Elizabeth's brother was to not produce an heir, the throne would pass to her sister Mary, and if Mary was to not produce an heir, then the throne would pass to her. Despite this, she and her half-sister were not legitimated as part of this process. It is important to note that the line of succession, should all 3 of Henry VIII's children fail to produce an heir, was to pass to the lineage of his younger sister Mary Brandon, Elizabeth's aunt. However, this succession change passed over the claims of Henry VIII's elder sister, Margaret, another of Elizabeth's aunt's claims. She had been married to King James IV of Scotland and would go on to have a son, King James V of Scotland. Through him, a granddaughter would be born, who was named Mary. This granddaughter of Margaret Tudor, Mary, is infamously known today as Mary, Queen of Scots. The claims of this line will come up again throughout Elizabeth's story. In 1546, Elizabeth, around 14 years old and with fresh political prospects, was brought to court and came under the supervision of her stepmother, Catherine Parr. Within a year, in January 1547, Elizabeth's father died, and thus an unsettling new chapter of Elizabeth's life was now to begin. At the time of Elizabeth's father's death, her governess Cat Ashley believed that a marriage had been in the works for Elizabeth. She was under the impression that the late king was intent on marrying Elizabeth to his brother-in-law, a man named Thomas Seymour. Thomas Seymour was the brother of Queen Jane Seymour, who had died giving birth to Elizabeth's half-brother Edward, as we have already touched on. Thomas, as we remember, was also the brother to Edward Seymour, who had carried Elizabeth in his arms at young Prince Edward's christening. After Elizabeth's father's death, the executors of his will deemed that Edward Seymour, who was elevated to the dukedom of Somerset and will hence be referred to as Somerset, was to be made protector. The Seymour brothers were not particularly fond of each other, and the younger of the two, Thomas, was upset that his elder brother was rewarded in this way, despite the fact that he himself was made Lord High Admiral and elevated to the peerage as Baron Seymour of Sudeley. If there was any truth to the idea that Thomas Seymour could be married to Elizabeth, this was crushed when his brother came into power as protector, as there was no way that Somerset would have allowed this. But Thomas Seymour was cunning and ambitious, and refused to settle for what had been allotted for him. Seymour was an attractive bachelor in his 30s, and he used his connections to Elizabeth's brother, the now King Edward VI, to secure a marriage blessing to marry Elizabeth's stepmother, the Queen Dowager Catherine Parr. Catherine, for her part, was an excited participant in this plan, for she had previously desired to marry Thomas Seymour prior to her marriage to Elizabeth's father. In the end, the plan was successful, for although many were greatly displeased when the marriage came to light, including Protector Somerset, there was little that could be done. Thus, once the marriage had been acknowledged, Thomas Seymour moved in with his wife Catherine, where Elizabeth was also staying at the time. Thomas, with his joyful personality and affable humor, made quite an impression on Catherine's household, including on young Elizabeth herself. It was said that Elizabeth developed somewhat of a crush on Thomas, for she would often blush when hearing his name, and was much pleased when he was praised in her presence. Unfortunately, this arrangement would not end well. Soon Seymour was engaging in suggestively sexual behavior towards Elizabeth, coming into her bedchamber before she awoke or was fully dressed. He even allegedly went as far as trying to kiss her when she was still in bed. Although Elizabeth was surely intrigued by this older, powerful, and attractive man, she was not necessarily a willing participant in all of this, and began to wake up earlier so that she could be clothed and ready before Seymour found her. Cat Ashley was initially pleased that Seymour took a liking to Elizabeth, but soon even she began to have issues with his conduct. When Seymour was confronted by Ashley for some of his inappropriate behavior, he denied that this was anything more than friendly interaction and swore no evil was meant by it. Catherine Parr also did not see any issue with the behavior initially, and actually took part in some of it, but by 1548 she was pregnant and beginning to feel ill, and thus Seymour's behavior began to weigh on her mind. She began to realize that Seymour's actions were not just innocent fun, and thus, after she allegedly came upon the two locked in an embrace, she suggested that Elizabeth should be moved. Catherine sternly addressed a silent and unhappy Elizabeth before her departure. Elizabeth may have been upset by her departure from her stepmother's household, but this gave her more free time to focus on her studies, and soon Elizabeth began to look upon the change with a more mature understanding. Her tutor, William Grindal, died of the plague, and he was replaced by a man named Roger Ascham. It was a good fit, for Ascham was a man that believed that learning should be made enjoyable for students, and that it would be a mistake to push them too hard in their studies. It was under Ascham that Elizabeth would perform double translations, where passages were translated to English and then back again to be compared to the original. She also made great strides in her penmanship during this time, and also regularly partook in writing, hunting, dancing, and music. In 1548, news reached Elizabeth that Catherine Parr had died due to complications of childbirth. Cat Ashley, despite the experiences in Catherine Parr's household, believed that Thomas Seymour would now be free to potentially marry Elizabeth. She urged Elizabeth to write letters of condolence to Seymour, but Elizabeth refused, realizing that she must be cautious when dealing with him. Nevertheless, Ashley and others foolishly began to discuss the matter amongst themselves. However, soon Thomas Seymour's conniving and ambitious nature finally caught up with him. Plans to potentially kidnap Elizabeth's brother, the king, came to light, along with the potential marriage discussions for Elizabeth's hand. This was looked upon in the most damaging light, and soon Seymour and some in Elizabeth's household, including Cat Ashley, were arrested and moved to the Tower of London. The 15-year-old Elizabeth was then interrogated by the council about her experiences with Seymour in the past. Any wrong answers could have condemned those in her household, but Elizabeth was found to have an unwavering dedication to those close to her, especially Cat Ashley. Elizabeth would not crack under pressure and remained steadfast in her defense and innocence. The members of her household remained less steadfast in their secrecy, and in the end they relayed the embarrassing encounters that Elizabeth had had with Seymour. Although embarrassing, what was revealed was not necessarily damaging or incriminating, and thus the council accepted that they had reached the truth of the matter. Lives were spared, with the exception of Thomas Seymour, who was charged with treason and executed for his plans with regard to the young King Edward. Elizabeth was distraught at Seymour's attainder and execution, but she had other issues to deal with. Kat Ashley was deemed unfit to be Elizabeth's governess and was to be removed from her position and replaced, to Elizabeth's utter dismay. However, Elizabeth was determined to keep her servants in her service and thus vehemently begged for her servants to be returned to her. In the end, she had her way. Kat Ashley returned to her service after swearing to stay out of Elizabeth's marriage prospects in the future. The whole Seymour fiasco was a harsh learning experience for Elizabeth, but with her servants returning, she now focused on rehabilitating herself in the eyes of her brother, the king. She was fearful that her image had been irreparably damaged and did not want to be reflected on as a woman who was liberal in her sexuality or questionable in her loyalty. Thus, she now attempted to present herself in a reserved and respectful manner. She dressed plainly and began to write to the council on her activities as to portray that she would not undertake anything without their approval. This worked well, and in December 1549, she was invited to her brother's court where she was received warmly. But drama in Elizabeth's youth was far from coming to an end, and there was still harsh lessons to be learned. In October 1549, Protector Somerset was removed from his position and replaced by his rival, the eventual Duke of Northumberland, John Dudley. Somerset, although returning to the council for a while, would be executed under this new leadership. For some time, the men responsible for Edward's government had been implementing radical religious change in England, making large strides towards Protestantism nationally. The middle ground type of religious settlement that Elizabeth's father had been keen to see implemented was pushed clearly in the direction of Protestantism. Yes, the English Church was free from the Pope in Rome, but as we already discussed, many of the old Catholic practices remained in place in England. Under Elizabeth's brother, however, many of these traditions in the Mass came under attack, as did practicing Catholics in England as a whole. Although Elizabeth was clearly left of center with regard to religion and was more geared towards the Protestant ways, her elder sister Mary was the exact opposite. She had been raised in the old faith and remained steadfastly dedicated to it despite the changes that were happening in England. Specifically, Mary was opposed to the prayer books and acts of uniformity that were imposed during young Edward's reign, which attempted to force a certain type of Protestant service to be adhered to. Although Mary initially simply wished for her and Elizabeth's father's religious settlement to be reinstated, eventually her position would evolve into her attempting to reconcile with the Pope in Rome, something we will discuss shortly. However, during young Edward's reign, Mary was in quite a precarious position, as John Dudley was less conciliatory towards her than Protector Somerset had been in the past. Additionally, as Edward grew, it became clear that he was firmly in the Protestant camp and would not waver in his dedication to his faith. Mary's failure to adhere to the religious changes was becoming an issue to Edward, Dudley, and the council. This issue became more worrisome in 1553, when Edward became sick and it became apparent that he would not survive. If Edward did not survive, Mary was, by law, the next in line to inherit the throne, and it was understood that all the religious change that had been implemented during Edward's rule would be undone if this came to fruition. Thus, Edward and John Dudley, Duke of Northumberland, set out to adjust the succession to skip both Mary and Elizabeth based on their illegitimacy. They attempted to bestow the crown on the lineage of Mary Brandon, Elizabeth, Mary, and Edward's paternal aunt discussed previously. There were no living male heirs to inherit at the time, and thus the succession was set to be inherited by a 15-year-old girl named Jane Grey, the eldest living grandchild of Mary Brandon through her eldest daughter. It was the intention that Elizabeth's sister Mary would be taken into custody after Edward's death, but just prior to his demise, she fled to her power bases in the east. Although Lady Jane Grey was proclaimed queen in London, Mary rallied her forces, and eventually, the council submitted to her and her followers. She triumphantly marched to London amidst cheering crowds, and Elizabeth met her north of the city in a quasi-show of support. The relationship between the two half-sisters had for the most part been cold from the start, and as we will soon see, this cold relationship would be a source of much despair for Elizabeth in the future. John Dudley, Duke of Northumberland, had set out to capture Mary, but once word reached him that the council in London had submitted, he knew that the gig was up. He was arrested and executed for his role in the attempted sidestepping of the succession. Although the meetup between Elizabeth and Mary had been cordial, after the dust settled, Elizabeth's sister, now Queen Mary I, began to fester with animosity towards Elizabeth yet again. Additionally, many around Mary considered Elizabeth a serious political threat, and religion was an easy catalyst for a further deterioration of relations between the two sisters. As we discussed previously, Mary remained dedicated to the Catholic faith and now set about a Catholic reconciliation between the Church of England and the Pope in Rome. Mary, of course, believed that pushback to this would be little if none, but what she actually found was there was considerable pushback to this, as many simply wished to return to the religious settlement that had been implemented by Elizabeth's father. But Mary was dedicated to restoring England to Catholicism, and thus the prayer books were made illegal, the Acts of Uniformity were repealed, and the heresy laws in England would eventually be reenacted. Religious persecutions would eventually manifest against Protestants and would take the form of public executions by burning, although these steps were not taken immediately. Elizabeth had initially boycotted the attempted religious change, but she was not prepared to die for her beliefs. When granted a private audience with her sister, she begged for forgiveness from Mary for her failure to conform and claimed that she was now seeing the error in her ways. She blamed her upbringing for her initial obstinacy and claimed that she was now open to be instructed in the old faith. Mary was initially overjoyed by her sister's offer to convert, but once it came time for Elizabeth to attend Mass for the first time, it became clear that the change would not happen so easily. She attempted to back out of attending on account of illness. This, of course, troubled Mary, who had always remained somewhat skeptical of her sister's offer to conform. But Mary had other issues to contend with, and one of these issues, the issue of marriage, would become a point that would resonate with Elizabeth as she watched events unfold for her elder half-sister. Mary married Philip II of Spain in 1554, and this caused great unrest in the kingdom. The issue of marriage for a queen ruling in their own right was untested, and this really was a no-win situation at the time. It was feared that marrying a man within England could bring back some sort of civil conflict akin to the infamous Wars of the Roses, but marrying internationally could bring the kingdom under the control of a foreign king who would put the needs of England behind the needs of his own realm. Thus, when Mary decided to marry Philip, many were greatly opposed to the marriage. This is where Elizabeth was to experience one of the greatest threats to her life. Mary attempted to find a Catholic husband for Elizabeth and continued day after day to find a way to exclude her sister from the succession. Elizabeth retreated to the country, and soon discontent to Mary's Spanish marriage began to grow throughout the country. The result was rebellion, and a rebellion with the partial intention of deposing Mary in favor of Elizabeth. Exactly how much of these plans were known to Elizabeth is unclear, but although she may not have overtly entered into agreement with the conspirators, many believe that she was aware of the uprising's intentions. When Wyatt's Rebellion, as it's referred to today, finally took place, Elizabeth was ill, and it has been argued that even if she had any enthusiasm for the rebels' cause, her illness surely limited this greatly. When Mary heard of the rebellion, she summoned Elizabeth to London, who was unable to obey the order due to said illness. This, of course, was seen as a sign to many that Elizabeth was clearly involved in the rebellion. In the end, Wyatt's rebellion fell apart after reaching London, and thus Elizabeth was required to obey her summons to London. Still ill, she made the trip very slowly, taking 11 days to arrive. Lady Jane was executed as part of this rebellion due to her father's involvement, showing that there would be no mercy to anyone who may have even the slightest ties to the uprising. Elizabeth was put into isolation, while confessions were extracted from the ringleaders of the rebellion. Wyatt had indeed sent Elizabeth a letter and admitted to doing so, but nothing conclusive was able to stick to Elizabeth. Mary remained unconvinced of her sister's innocence and was advised both against and for moving against Elizabeth. Some were under the impression that this would be the perfect time for Mary to rid herself of her troublesome sister. Mary was convinced to transfer Elizabeth to the Tower of London, the same spot that Elizabeth's mother had been executed years prior. This was incredibly troubling to Elizabeth, as in her eyes, she could only have expected to be put on trial after reaching the Tower. She wrote to her sister in utter despair at the situation, declaring her innocence, rebutting the allegations against her, but it was to no avail. Elizabeth was taken by river in the pouring rain to enter the Tower, and protested defiantly upon her arrival. Although Elizabeth surely languished in the Tower and experienced a great deal of stress from the situation, Mary in the end would not take action against her sister. The evidence against Elizabeth was just not strong enough to warrant such action in many eyes. Instead, Mary agreed that Elizabeth was to be placed under house arrest in the country, with a counselor acting as her custodian. This responsibility was taken on by Sir Henry Bedingfield, and when the time came to take her from the Tower, she still held fear that she was being led to her death. She was taken to the manor house of Woodstock, which had fallen into disrepair. Despite her alleged connection to the Wyatt plot, she was cheered by the people of London as she left on her way to Woodstock. Bedingfield found Elizabeth somewhat difficult to deal with, as she complained immediately about her lodging situation. Bedingfield took his responsibility seriously and did things by the book, to Elizabeth's dismay. Items were denied to her, correspondence with the Queen was eliminated for a while, and Elizabeth's previous ailments soon returned. Around this time in early 1555, the Protestant burnings began taking place, and after Philip II of Spain had landed in England and married Mary, word began to spread of a pregnancy. Although many people may not have been sympathetic to the Protestants being burned, the overall persecution was looked at unfavorably by most within the kingdom. Ironically, the Catholic clergy's involvement in this process only furthered the anti-Catholic sentiment held by many throughout the realm, and arguably did more damage to the cause than helped it. Add to this Spanish influence now perceived to be playing a part in Mary's decision-making, and Mary was becoming less popular by the day. In this odd and new experience of a dual monarchy in England, an interesting dynamic began to emerge, and one must understand a global picture in this regard. Philip's realms, which would eventually include the Low Countries, i.e. the Netherlands, and Spain, had been at war with France for some time, and Philip's marriage to Mary would be instrumental in bringing England into the war on the side of the Spanish. However, Philip was well aware that if Mary was to die childless, he would not be able to maintain control over England. Here is where the passed over branch of the Tudors discussed previously comes into play. As we recently touched on, Elizabeth's father had an elder sister, Margaret Tudor, whose lineage was passed over in the Succession Act, which had restored Mary and Elizabeth. Her granddaughter, Mary, known today as Mary Queen of Scots, was actually at one point betrothed to Elizabeth's brother when her father still lived. However, the French had long been allies to the Scots and had historically used Scotland as a way to harass England via what is known as the Auld Alliance between the two countries. Mary Queen of Scots would not marry Elizabeth's brother. Instead, she would be married off to the Dauphin of France, Francis, who would eventually become Francis II of France. Thus, Mary Queen of Scots was moved to France when she was young and was brought up there. Mary Queen of Scots had one of the more compelling claims to the throne, and this gave cause for concern to Philip. If he lost control over England in the event of his wife Mary's death, he could not afford Mary Queen of Scots becoming queen due to her French influences. Therefore, although Philip initially was hostile towards Elizabeth, he now began to hedge his bets somewhat, and would be prepared to make sure Elizabeth succeeded to the throne in order to prevent Mary Queen of Scots from doing so herself. The fact that Elizabeth's sister Mary's pregnancy turned out to be a false one only added to Philip's desires to somewhat protect Elizabeth from her domestic enemies. Of course, this could not have pleased Elizabeth's sister in the slightest, as she was infatuated with her new husband. Nevertheless, Mary remained hostile to Elizabeth even after Philip departed England to deal with issues in his own realms. Mary was aging, and Elizabeth was still heir presumptive based on the Succession Act put forth by their father near the end of his reign. Elizabeth returned to Hatfield, and unfortunately, another plot known as the Dudley Plot was discovered, which had, as its intention, replacing Mary with Elizabeth. Cat Ashley was arrested and taken to the Tower, but none of the conspirators linked Elizabeth to the plot. Additionally, Elizabeth's popularity and position as heir made moving against her almost impossible at this time. As Elizabeth's prospects of becoming queen increased, Philip desperately tried ways to keep some form of control, pushing to be crowned himself and attempting to induce Elizabeth to marry one of his Catholic allies, Emmanuel Philibert, the Duke of Savoy. Elizabeth knew what was afoot and rejected the offer. This forced arrangement was attempted again when Philip returned to England for a second and final time, but again Elizabeth refused. It was around this time in 1557 that England entered the war between Spain and France. In January of the following year, England was delivered a crushing blow when their last possession on the continent, Calais, was lost to the French. Although Calais was expensive to maintain, its loss severely deteriorated morale in England. Although Mary clung to the idea that she was now pregnant, this again would prove to be false, and it was now becoming clear that Elizabeth would indeed become queen, as Mary's health began to rapidly decline. Many people began to make contact with her at Hatfield, and Philip and his Spanish nobility were now set on maintaining a good relationship with her, something that she, of course, initially reciprocated. By early November, it was clear that Mary would not last much longer, and she was finally convinced to acknowledge Elizabeth as her successor. On the 17th of November, Elizabeth's rival and half-sister died. Upon receiving the news, she fell to her knees. It was time for the new Queen of England to take her place on the throne. Elizabeth had been proclaimed queen on the same day that her sister died, and despite her overwhelmed response to the news, major issues existed in England. The kingdom itself was weak and divided, and there were many who questioned whether Elizabeth would be able to fix the mess that she had inherited. But Elizabeth was now a determined and confident character whose intelligence and willpower had brought her to where she now found herself. She also truly believed that she had been brought to the throne by divine intervention, and this suppressed any doubts or insecurities she may have had about being only the second woman to rule in her own right in England. Still at Hatfield, she now appointed a man who would be perhaps her greatest influence during her time as queen. This man was the son of one of Elizabeth's father's court officials and had been educated at St. John's College, Cambridge. He subsequently had learned law and had at one point been Protector Somerset's private secretary. He had also been appointed Secretary of State during Elizabeth's brother's reign, but subsequently declined to keep the position when Elizabeth's sister came to the throne based on his Protestant leanings. He had had regular dealings with Elizabeth previously and had become surveyor of her lands in 1550. This man's name was William Cecil, eventually to be known as Lord Burleigh, and he would use his vast knowledge to assist Elizabeth, as we will see, on almost every aspect of government in the coming years. Their bond in government, of course, would not always be a happy one, and the two would be at odds with each other during their long stint together. But Cecil would always remain a voice that Elizabeth respected and acknowledged, even in times of disagreement. After almost a week after being proclaimed queen, Elizabeth rode to London, arriving to the Tower amidst great celebration. In the following weeks, she revamped her council and kept only 10 of her sister's counselors in their place while her coronation was simultaneously being planned. Of course, there was always the risk that the French would push the claims of Mary, Queen of Scots, and argue that she was the rightful Queen of England, but Elizabeth could certainly count on the support of her former brother-in-law, Philip II of Spain, for as we touched on previously, he would not stand for the French-influenced Mary, Queen of Scots attaining the English crown. On January 15, 1559, around 2 months after Elizabeth succeeded to the throne, she was crowned as Elizabeth I of England in a grand and joyous ceremony. The Mass that followed was read in English and Latin, a clear sign to many that Elizabeth would be a champion of the Protestant cause, although she did not publicly indicate where her loyalties religion-wise truly laid initially. But after the coronation had taken place, Elizabeth did indeed clarify her religious position, although it wasn't evidently clear exactly what she would do from there on out. If she once again severed ties with Rome, it could reasonably be expected that the French would push Mary, Queen of Scots' claim to the throne. They could do this while claiming that a holy crusade was being pursued against a heretic queen and would most likely have the support of the Pope. Yes, Philip would not want to see Mary, Queen of Scots installed on the English throne, but he too was a fervent Catholic, and so there could be no guarantees that Elizabeth could count on his protection in a situation like this. However, Elizabeth knew the Pope would never acknowledge her parents' marriage as legitimate, and thus, if she intended to remain a queen in a Catholic kingdom, the Pope would have to issue some form of dispensation to allow an illegitimate Elizabeth, in their eyes, to sit on the English throne. This, of course, was unacceptable to Elizabeth, who believed that the crown was hers by birthright. What exactly Elizabeth would do was unclear, but threats from a religious standpoint would not only come from the conservative Catholic side. In fact, Protestantism had a wide range of varying beliefs, and many Protestants who had fled to the country during Elizabeth's sister's reign had their beliefs influenced to the point of radicalization by groups that existed on the continent, mainly the Calvinists, who were considered at the time far more aggressive in their pursuits of Protestantism. These Puritans, as some of them would become known, were particularly opposed to the lack of moral control over the lay peers, including the Queen herself, who they believed should not be considered governor of the church, a topic we will touch on shortly. It is important to note that Elizabeth would maintain some of the more traditional customs that had been adhered to by the Catholic Church, as her father had done, and would for many years tolerate subliminal Catholicism in England, as we will see. Elizabeth was well aware of the Puritan threat and would take steps to limit Puritan influences in Parliament. Many of the Protestants returning from exile wished to push the religious agenda further than what had been achieved during Elizabeth's brother's Protestant reign, but Elizabeth had no intention of allowing a small minority to control or influence what religious settlement was to be applied to her kingdom. By December, the state of religion was effectively restored to what it had been under her father, and after Parliament assembled in January 1559, a bill was passed enabling Elizabeth to resume use of the title Supreme Head of the Church if she chose, although this was adjusted to Supreme Governor in order to appease some. The Commons were angered that their original bill had been dumbed down and altered by the House of Lords, but in the end, it still reflected advances back towards Protestantism. The Second Act of Supremacy of 1558 required all clergymen and royal officials to take an oath to recognize Elizabeth as Supreme Governor of the Church, and anyone who refused to do so was liable to lose their office. Additionally, the heresy laws that were reenacted by Elizabeth's sister were repealed, and an act of uniformity was passed reinstating the Protestant-leaning prayer book of 1552, although the book was adjusted to be slightly less offensive to some of the more conservative-minded individuals. Of course, today we can look on this as somewhat of a compromise, as the Catholic Mass had been eliminated, but it was not deemed necessary to dig deep into people's core beliefs in order to weed out true Catholic-leaning individuals, at least for the time being. But some of Elizabeth's hardcore Protestant subjects were unhappy that Catholicism had not been attacked further. After the religious matters were settled legally, it still needed to be enforced, and thus, as one would expect, many of the existing Marian bishops refused to take the oath and were deprived of their offices, with many being imprisoned. The lower rank-and-file clergymen were much more open to conforming, but the elimination of the bishops left Elizabeth in a difficult position. She did not want to pull from the pool of Protestant exiles who returned after she became queen, for fear that they would be too radical in their Protestant faith. In the end, however, she was left no choice, and over half of the vacancies were filled by returning exiles from the continent. She did not get on particularly well with many of her bishops, and she disagreed with many of them on policies that were to be removed or kept. In addition, she would, over her time as queen, burden them with financial difficulties and debts. She was partly to blame for the deterioration of the episcopate, i.e. the bishops, which was an absolute reality during her time as queen. Although religion in England was somewhat settled for the time being, we will see that it will become a common theme sewn into almost every aspect of decision-making at a high level for Elizabeth. In April 1559, the Treaty of Cadiz was signed with France. The war with France had not simply ended on Mary's death, and the treaty was welcomed by many, as the endeavor was quite expensive. Unfortunately, Elizabeth was not able to regain Calais, which had been lost by her sister, and there still was other major pressing issues that Elizabeth needed to confront. Perhaps the greatest of these issues was the topic of marriage. In short, Elizabeth was almost in an unwinnable situation when it came to marriage. On one hand, she needed an heir, for this would alleviate any worries of civil conflict should she die unexpectedly. Additionally, as was the case with her sister, a husband could help manage her affairs, especially public affairs, as this was still seen as a man's duty in that time. However, on the other hand, Elizabeth's sister's marriage had proved to be a difficult pill for many within the kingdom to swallow, and Elizabeth could only expect a similar type of reaction if she was to marry. If she married someone foreign, as her sister did, she could expect her husband to assume England would assist in his foreign affairs, something that would have been quite unpopular. Wyatt's rebellion and England's entry into the war with France had provided evidence that this was not only plausible, but quite possibly inevitable. She could of course take a domestic husband, one of her own subjects, but Elizabeth was convinced that elevating one man above all other English suitors would bring rise to resentment and pushback. to any type of kingly settlement that may be bestowed upon the groom, and she was probably right. She would then be forced to preside over a divided, jealous, and angry court, which could bring rise to other major issues in the kingdom. In the end, Elizabeth would handle this problem the same way she would handle many other major problems that would arise for her during her time as queen. She would simply remain in a form of unsettled lingo, where she would remain open to ideas and input, but never fully follow through on any actions or promises. As we will see, this would keep those around her guessing, sometimes furiously, sometimes lamentedly, as more time was bought. Despite the urging by many to begin the process of taking a husband, she remained hesitant to take on such a task. It should be noted, however, that for all her hesitancy or even insistence against marriage, she was still quite fond of unofficial courtships and flirtation, enjoying the flattery that emanated from these interactions. She would embark on multiple courtships throughout her life, which each time left those intent on winning her hand or convincing her to marry in suspense that indeed a marriage may be right around the corner. But Elizabeth was a champion of show and adored the adulation of her people. Her virginity was seized upon as a way to glorify her and prove that she still was indeed dedicated to her people above all else. Perhaps the marriage issue would have been less a source of contention if she had been prepared to name a successor, but in this she also refused. Based on her own tense experiences during her sister's reign, she was convinced that an heir presumptive would always be the rallying point for those discontented with the reigning sovereign, regardless whether the heir was privy to these subversions or not. Thus, she was not inclined to attempt to prevent any rebellious spirits from gaining someone who they might champion in the name of rebellion. Additionally, there were multiple claimants to the throne at this time, including Mary Stuart, aka Mary Queen of Scots, who had perhaps the best claim to be heir. In addition to Mary, there were the younger sisters of Jane Grey, Catherine and Mary, whose father had been attainted of treason, and who would each be generally disliked by Elizabeth. There were also the grandsons of Queen Margaret Tudor of Scotland, Mary Queen of Scots' grandmother discussed previously, from a separate marriage. After Margaret Tudor's first husband, King James IV of Scotland, died, she again married twice. It was through the daughter of a separate marriage that the grandsons were produced. One of these grandsons of Margaret Tudor was named Henry Stuart, Lord Darnley. He will come up again in a major way. Nevertheless, all of the claimants had arguments against their claim that could prevent them from being declared heir, and thus the group's claims as a whole were quite unimpressive. Elizabeth here also hoped to keep people guessing, and used her indecisiveness as a weapon. Over time, she would use this uncertain state of limbo to entice claimants to refrain from attacking her in order to prevent her displeasure, but this would also serve to prevent anyone from gaining the heir presumptive title, which, as we've already touched on, could be used to form opposition. Elizabeth's subjects were unsurprisingly unhappy with this, for if she refused to marry and refused to name an heir, her death could very well bring civil or international war to England. It was therefore paramount that Elizabeth used the many courtships that would come her way as a distraction from the truth of the matter. Philip II of Spain was actually the first to propose marriage to Elizabeth in a feeble attempt to keep hold of England and keep it Catholic. This, of course, was rejected, but other suitors were now showing themselves. One of these suitors was actually Philip's cousin, Charles II, Archduke of Austria, whose negotiations would fail on account of religion. Another, more famous suitor was one of Elizabeth's subjects. This man was a younger son of the Duke of Northumberland, John Dudley, who had been executed for attempting to put Jane Grey on the throne. Near Elizabeth in age, he had known her since childhood and had been sent to the Tower after attempting to back his father's coup. He then subsequently served in France, being involved in the Battle of Saint-Quentin before returning to England somewhat rehabilitated. He was physically attractive, intellectually capable, an expert jouster, an avid hunter, fisherman, archer, and tennis player. He was also a quite affable individual to those around him, and was a patron of the arts. This man's name was Lord Robert Dudley, and his relationship with the Queen would be an interesting one, as we will shortly see. After Elizabeth ascended to the throne, Dudley had been named as Master of the Horse, essentially putting him in charge of the royal stables. This position allowed him lodgings at court, as this position was one of the more senior positions available. By spring of 1559, he was being seen as somewhat of a favorite, with Elizabeth treating him with abject favor and friendly affection. His presence was known to bring up her spirits, as he would amuse her in any way he could, especially with his wit and sense of humor, which made Elizabeth laugh often. However, there was a potential problem with their relationship. Dudley was already married. As one could imagine, rumors began to fly of inappropriate relations between the two, but many defended the Queen and were adamant that the Queen had remained steadfast in maintaining her honor. As Dudley grew closer to Elizabeth, his unpopularity grew as well, not only due to the favoritism being shown, but due to him being of a lineage plagued by treasonous behavior. Although Dudley may have been friendly in nature, he was also deviously jealous and would over time work to undermine any potential marriage suits that would arise, including that of Archduke Charles of Austria. Elizabeth, despite being aware of the dislike that was growing towards Dudley, did not care in the slightest, and would consistently go out of her way to make sure that Dudley was comfortable and around her. One of Dudley's most outspoken enemies was the highest-ranking nobleman in England, the 24-year-old Thomas Howard, Duke of Norfolk, second cousin to Elizabeth. Howard was particularly upset with Dudley's undermining of the negotiations with Archduke Charles, for it was becoming clear that England needed international allies. There were fears that because young Mary, Queen of Scots, was under French control, Scotland could be used as a springboard for an invasion of the country. This was not an unfounded fear, for Mary was Catholic, and her mother, Mary of Guise, was acting as regent of Scotland while her young daughter was away in France. The Guise family, led by the Dukes of Guise, will be discussed throughout Elizabeth's story. Mary of Guise was also attempting to suppress Protestantism in Scotland and had imported French troops. Protestant Scottish subjects began to conspire, and it was hoped that the Protestant Elizabeth would support this group should they choose to rise up. But Elizabeth was unequivocally opposed to uprisings of the sort, for she refused to support any type of endeavor against the sovereign and their establishment as a matter of principle. She considered rebellions against kings and queens as the worst form of disobedience, and not only would she be utterly opposed to this in her kingdom, but would refuse to support it in others. William Cecil, on the other hand, disagreed with the Queen on this matter. To add further concern to the situation, Henry II of France died in 1559, and his son, Mary Queen of Scots' husband, ascended to the French throne as Francis II of France. He was 15 years old at the time and was firmly influenced by Mary's mother's family, the Guises, who were intensely Catholic and ambitious in nature. This influence pushed Mary Queen of Scots to be more assertive in her claim to the English throne. This prompted Elizabeth to somewhat give way with regards to the Protestant Scottish rebels and aided them by providing them money. By the fall of 1559, the Scottish nobles had declared that Mary of Guise was no longer the regent. Cecil and some of Elizabeth's other counselors wished to send troops to Scotland and to blockade French ships in order to prevent French troops from reinforcing Mary of Guise. However, Elizabeth would have none of this, and the plan was vetoed. She did not want to give the French any undisputable reasoning for launching an attack into England to try and remove her from the throne. But Cecil remained steadfast in his commitment to this cause and submitted his resignation due to the matter. Elizabeth relented and agreed to send aid via the Treaty of Berwick, but made sure that it was clear that she was not supporting rebels, but actually Scots still loyal to Mary Queen of Scots against the foreign invasion of France. In March, the army advanced and laid a disastrous siege to Leith, but Elizabeth refused to attack Edinburgh Castle, where Mary of Guise had fled to. Eventually, after supplies dried up in Leith, and Mary of Guise surprisingly died, the French requested open negotiation with the English. The Treaty of Edinburgh was concluded, which was to see French remove troops from Scotland and Mary Queen of Scots renounce all claims to the English throne, but the ratification of the treaty was not immediately forthcoming from the French. Elizabeth henceforth was less willing to support the Protestant Scottish Lords of the Congregation, as they are sometimes referred to. This made some, especially Cecil, believe that this group would become disheartened and seek to rekindle their relationship with France in order to receive monetary benefits. Cecil had been one of the main drivers of the Treaty of Edinburgh, and in his absence, Elizabeth had grown even more affectionate towards Robert Dudley. She began to put her relationship with Dudley ahead of stately affairs, often hunting and riding with him. This only heightened the rumors about the two, and an unfortunate event would bring great despair to the relationship. On September 8, 1560, Dudley's wife Amy was found dead at the foot of a staircase with a broken neck in the manor house she was staying at in Oxfordshire. As one could imagine, rumors abounded that Dudley had had his wife killed in order to free a path to marry the Queen, but what truly happened to her remains a mystery to this day. Of course, there were others who stood to gain from the ensuing scandal, including Cecil and others that were opposed to Dudley's suit of the Queen, but just as likely, Amy could have been terminally ill, and this unfortunate event could very well have been an ill-timed accident. However, no one in that time believed that to be the case. Dudley was sent away from court while the matter was investigated. The court returned a verdict of misadventure, and although Dudley returned to court, many felt that Dudley still was far from innocent in the matter. Despite this, Dudley felt perfectly inclined to actually take on a courtship with Elizabeth, and it could be argued that she was tempted to accept his suit. Of course, it was not that simple, due to the scandal with his wife and his unpopularity. If Elizabeth were to accept Dudley's advances, the kingdom would be turned into a chaotic scene of civil conflict, and her esteem internationally would have been greatly diminished. Nevertheless, she remained steadfast in her defense of Dudley and gave him no formal declination, but there was still no question of him being discarded or removed from her presence. The French were supposed to have ratified the Treaty of Edinburgh within 60 days, but as we have already touched on, this was not immediately forthcoming, and they were showing to be hesitant to do so. This was a serious issue, as if this treaty was not ratified, Mary Queen of Scots would not have to renounce her claims to the throne, and thus would still be in a position to put forward her claim. But the situation in France soon morphed, for Mary's husband, Francis II, died in December 1560 at 16 years old. His brother succeeded him as Charles IX, but due to his youth, a regency was implemented, with his mother, Catherine de' Medici, assuming control. This was potentially good for the English, as she would not be a puppet of the Guise family that controlled Francis II before he died. But soon disturbing information began to flow to England. It was said that Mary Queen of Scots was contemplating returning to Scotland to take over the reins of the kingdom. She had not yet sworn to the terms of the Treaty of Edinburgh, and thus, if she returned to Scotland, she would be in a position to push her claim to the English crown. Additionally, she was firmly and unequivocally Catholic, and this would not bode well for the Protestant Scottish nobles currently in power. Mary was denied safe passage by the English and was forced to travel by sea back to Scotland, landing in Leith in August 1561. She immediately connected with her subjects, being attractive, affable, and endearing in a way that so many found irresistible. However, in contrast to Elizabeth's mostly calculated and shrewd mind, Mary was quite emotional at times, something that clouded her judgment and would lead to great trouble for her, as we will soon see. Once installed, Mary hoped to make peace with England, but this was contingent on her being reinstated to the line of English succession. Elizabeth required first that Mary must ratify the Treaty of Edinburgh, which of course still had not been done. Threats from Mary's ambassador were an unwelcome wake-up call and caused Elizabeth to attempt to make peace with Mary, but the matter remained unsettled for the time being. With a potential conflict on the horizon between England and Scotland, there was also unsettling problems arising in France that were quasi-related to the interactions in Scotland. The French regent, Catherine de' Medici, was struggling to prevent civil war from breaking out on the basis of religion. While many in France, including the royal family, were Catholic, there was a Protestant minority known as the Huguenots, or the Huguenots in English, who were becoming less willing to adhere to the Catholic faith. Fearing a rise in Mary's maternal Catholic French family discussed previously, the Guises, Elizabeth was urged to assist the Huguenots. Elizabeth was hesitant to do so and believed that peace with Mary Queen of Scots would still be possible despite what was happening in France. In fact, there were discussions for the two queens to meet, but in the end, this was not to be. Civil war did indeed break out in France, something known today as the French Wars of Religion, and the threats of the Guises seizing control of France was now a serious one. An expedition was planned, and in September 1562, English troops landed in New Haven, aka Le Havre, France, led by Robert Dudley's brother, Ambrose, Earl of Warwick. It was at this time that Elizabeth came down with smallpox, and there was great concern that she would not survive. After losing her speech, she was wrapped while unconscious in flannel and laid in front of the fire for 2 hours before she finally began to recover. It was also around this time that the Duke of Norfolk and Robert Dudley were appointed to the council. The situation in France was not much better, as the Huguenots were not faring well. In March 1563, they came to terms with the French government and incredibly agreed to join forces with them to drive the English army from the continent if the English refused to leave. Of course, the Queen was unhappy with this, but she had other issues to worry about, as she had been forced to call a parliament in order to pay for this expensive endeavor in France. Money was indeed granted, but Elizabeth was put through the ringer, as she was constantly petitioned on the matter of her marriage. Although many were optimistic about holding on to New Haven on the continent, an outbreak of the plague made this all but impossible, and by July, the town was surrendered. Worse yet, returning soldiers brought the plague back to England with them, and London was hit hard by the epidemic. This pursuit on the continent was a failure, but Elizabeth had learned a lesson in the cost and upkeep of a force in a foreign land, something that she would not soon forget. But Elizabeth's northern border was again to become the focus for England, for much drama was soon to unfold. Contrary to Elizabeth's hesitance to marry, Mary, Queen of Scots, was keen on the idea. This, of course, was disturbing to many in England, for if Mary found a Catholic prince to wed her, the danger in England would be heightened even more. If Mary married a strong foreign Catholic prince, she could no doubt have the capacity, through her husband, to forcefully push her claim to the throne, utilizing resources from her husband's realms. Mary very well could take a lesser husband, but being that she had already been married to the King of France, the likelihood that she would stoop to this level was minimal, unless, of course, Elizabeth recognized her in the succession. Elizabeth, of course, was not tolerant of this, and actually suggested her own court flame, Robert Dudley, to be a potential match. The idea was that she could count on Dudley to keep Mary in check, and would never doubt his loyalty to her or England. It also had the added benefit for Elizabeth of marrying Dudley to a queen, even though it would not be her. But Dudley was not even an earl at this point, and Mary was initially not happy with the suggestion. Thus, by 1564, negotiations were deadlocked. After marriage negotiations between Mary and Spain came to nothing, Mary became more open to the idea of marrying Dudley. Therefore, Elizabeth elevated Dudley to the peerage, making him Earl of Leicester, in order to shrink the gap in status between the two. When a commission met to discuss the matter at Berwick, it became clear that Mary would only consider the match if she was restored to the English succession. It was here that another descendant of Margaret Tudor, Queen of Scotland, we discussed previously, came to the forefront. Henry Stuart, Lord Darnley, who we must remember was also a grandchild of Margaret Tudor, same as Mary, Queen of Scots. He was sent to Scotland in hopes that Mary would seek to marry him instead of Dudley. Of course, it was not expected that this would actually happen, and it was believed that if Mary did wish to marry Lord Darnley, she would request permission from Elizabeth, as Darnley was an English subject. Dudley was all for this, as he did not wish to be pulled away from Elizabeth. Darnley was an attractive young man with blood connections to Scottish nobility, and was, in theory, a good match for Mary if ever there was one. He had his own claims to the English crown, and if the two were married, their claims would be merged. The fact that Darnley was English made the match even more dangerous for Elizabeth, as the foreign aspect of succession could not be used as an excuse to deny it. Thus, it was the initial intention to keep the two apart. Darnley also came from an unruly family and was raised Catholic. He would not be able to be relied upon to keep Mary in check when compared to someone like Dudley. In February, Mary graciously received Darnley, but nothing happened between the two, as Mary was still waiting to see if Elizabeth would grant her succession wishes if she married Dudley. When it became clear that Elizabeth had no intention of bringing Mary formally into the succession, Mary turned her attention to Darnley. Mary by this point was abjectly smitten with the attractive young man, and took the steps of conferring a Scottish peerage position on him. Once word began to spread in England that Mary was serious about taking Darnley as husband, without Elizabeth's consent, panic broke out. Darnley was summoned back to England, but by this time it was too late. He was proclaimed King of Scotland and was married in July 1565 to the Queen of Scots. The stage was being set for an epic showdown between Elizabeth and Mary. By autumn of 1566, Mary was pregnant, but other than this, things were not going well for her in Scotland. Darnley quickly made enemies, being arrogant and overbearing in nature. Mary quickly became disgusted by his actions, as he was turning out to be a disaster of a husband and king. His immaturity and drunkenness made him unpopular with all, and he frequently insulted his wife, the Queen. Having been denied the crown matrimonial, which would have made him equal in status to his wife, he set about turning his attentions to Mary's private secretary, an Italian man named David Rizzio, who Darnley believed was having an affair with Mary. Despite their hatred of Darnley, some of the Scots nobility were willing to ally with Darnley in his endeavor against Rizzio, and on March 9, 1566, Rizzio was dragged away from Mary at Holyrood Palace and murdered. Mary was understandably appalled, but being aware of how impressionable and foolish Darnley was, she used this to her advantage to convince him that his Scottish nobility allies were going to betray him. Thus, Darnley agreed to re-enter into an alliance with his wife and forsake his allies that had helped him carry out the murder. They escaped by horseback to Dunbar Castle before gathering forces and putting Darnley's co-conspirators to flight. Shortly thereafter, Mary gave birth to a son who was named James, and Elizabeth accepted an invitation to stand as his godmother by proxy. It seemed that perhaps, at least for the time being, tensions between the two kingdoms would finally settle down. But in England, of course, other pressing matters were becoming worrisome. Elizabeth's subjects were losing patience with her in regards to the marriage issue. Thus, by 1563, she again was interested in approaching Archduke Charles of Austria, and by 1565, the 14-year-old King of France, Charles IX, had come onto the radar as well. An offer was made for Elizabeth's hand, but was turned down by Elizabeth on account of Charles IX's age. With the Archduke of Austria, she required that he convert to Protestantism, something that was unlikely and of course threw the deal. One must not forget that Robert Dudley always remained at the center of Elizabeth's attention and was never eliminated from the running. By Christmas 1565, he proposed to Elizabeth, but the Queen would not make any declaration on the matter. Again, she kept all those around her in suspense, but would never commit to anything concrete. Another parliament met in September 1566, and with the marriage issue remaining as heavy as ever, a showdown was in order. She expected the Commons to be adamant as ever, but always expected to have the support of the Lords. In reality, however, many of the Lords, including the influential Duke of Norfolk, had had enough of Elizabeth's indecisiveness. She finally realized that the succession issue had left her utterly isolated, and to this she lashed out angrily at those around her. Her response was to attempt to appeal to the more moderate and clear-minded heads of the group. She attempted to suppress the Commons' voice in Parliament by claiming that they had no right to initiate debates on the topic, such as that of the succession and religion, unless prompted by her, but she knew that the Commons technically had a right to speak freely in Parliament. In the end, Parliament was dissolved, without Elizabeth having to settle the matter of succession. However, she also did not get the subsidy amount she had hoped for, nor had she been able to pass legislation she had been pushing. She had given a formal promise to Mary, but the wording was vague and allowed her time to figure another way around this. Nevertheless, the onslaught of this parliament was particularly draining to her, and she was happy that she would not have to face it again for some time. Attention soon turned back to the north when an incredible sequence of events took place in Scotland. In February 1567, a large explosion rocked Edinburgh in the early morning hours. A house on the outskirts of town was destroyed completely, and that house happened to house none other than Mary's husband, Lord Darnley. Darnley lay dead in the rubble, although it was believed by some that he had survived the explosion only to be strangled. Mary, who was not with Darnley when this happened, professed that she was appalled by the assassination of her husband and claimed that she believed it was her the assassins were most likely after. But few believed what she was saying, as her reconciliation with her husband had only lasted a short time. She had contemplated divorce from Darnley, but could not do so for fear of her son being deemed illegitimate. Darnley had actually traveled to Glasgow to visit family, but was convinced to return by Mary. He had fallen ill, and it was Mary who had installed him at the house on the outskirts of the town to complete his recovery. Suspicion and rumors against Mary abounded, and this suspicion was only furthered when the alleged identity of one of the assassins began to be circulated. It was a man named James Hepburn, Earl of Bothwell, someone who had recently found himself one of Mary's closest confidants. It was crucial for Mary to track down who did this and punish them if she ever wished to be exonerated from the crime, but she failed to act on the matter. A suit was brought against Bothwell, but was dismissed due to lack of evidence. However, shortly thereafter, in April 1567, Bothwell kidnapped the Queen, allegedly against her will, divorced his wife, and married the Queen of Scots. Of course, Mary very well could have been taken against her will, but there were many who believed that she had been privy to the plans and was a willing participant. Elizabeth was said to have been shocked that Mary would submit to her husband's murderer, and her impression of the Queen dropped immediately. Despite this, she remained steadfast in her beliefs that Mary could not be deposed from her position as Queen. Although Mary, Queen of Scots nobility were most likely aware of the assassination plot against Darnley, few, if none, were prepared to allow Bothwell to marry the Queen, and thus were prepared to stand up to him. Mary and Bothwell were forced to leave Edinburgh as opposition to them grew. The two attempted to return to confront the opposition, but could not muster up enough support and were forced to surrender. Bothwell was allowed to flee the country and died in captivity on the continent. Mary was transported to Edinburgh, being verbally abused by the crowds along the way, and eventually imprisoned at Lochleven Castle. This, of course, politically, was a great victory for England, as a Catholic queen who had never renounced her claims to the English throne was reduced to nothing while her Protestant nobles took control. But unfortunately, Elizabeth did not see it this way, and she remained troubled that an anointed monarch could be effectively dethroned in all but name and title or deposed. This lack of support could only push the Scottish lords back into the arms of the French, who were willing to re-establish their positive links there, despite the fact that Mary was a former French queen and the two groups did not agree on religion. The Protestant lords did not rule out executing Mary, but in the end, Mary was pressured into abdicating her throne to her at the time 1-year-old son James, who would effectively become James VI of Scotland. Elizabeth was obviously not happy with this, for again, she saw this as a stain on the institution of monarchy as a whole. She contemplated declaring war, but if Elizabeth was set on restoring Mary to her rightful place, the Scottish nobility could easily execute Mary, and thus she decided to proceed lightly. But in 1568, Mary escaped from Lochleven Castle and marched a force of gathered supporters to confront the Protestant lords. Her forces were defeated near Glasgow at the Battle of Langside, forcing her to flee from the field. She was advised to either remain in Scotland or to sail to France, but she declined to do either of these things. Instead, she wished to throw herself at the mercy of Elizabeth, who she felt was the only person who had defended her royal right in the past. It appeared initially that this might work, as Elizabeth was keen on meeting with Mary and receiving her with honor. However, with Mary's blood connection to the Guises, her past actions of failing to renounce her English claims, marrying Darnley without permission, marrying the anti-English Bothwell, and with the realization that it would not be in the best interest to reinstate a Catholic queen in Scotland, cooler heads prevailed. But failing to help her at all could easily be as concerning, for Mary would then go to France or some other world power to seek assistance, and if this power was successful in restoring her, she would surely remain loyal to them indefinitely. There were talks that Mary should be imprisoned against her will in England, but that gave rise to fear that she might be used as a source of rebellion in the future. However, the Scots claimed that they had written proof of Mary's involvement in Darnley's murder. Thus, a hearing was set to review the evidence, with Mary begrudgingly agreeing to allow Elizabeth's representatives to be sent on her behalf. This was initially set to take place at York, where the letters known as the casket letters were to be presented. After a preview of the letters were shown, the Duke of Norfolk entered the scene, as he wished to suppress the contents of the letters due to the fact that if Elizabeth died suddenly, Mary would be the obvious successor, and he did not believe that it would be proper for these letters to be floating around if there was still a chance of Mary inheriting the English crown. Some of Mary's supporters began to attempt to convince Norfolk that he should marry the Queen of Scots himself, as his wife had recently died, but for the time being, he ignored these ideas. Norfolk alerted the Scots that Elizabeth had no intention of restoring Mary, nor finding her guilty of murder, and this caused the Scots to draw back. The Scots wanted a guilty verdict, and thus they were cautious about presenting the casket letters officially. Elizabeth decided to have the proceedings moved closer to her at Westminster. The Scots were reassured that the proceedings were legitimate, and thus they formally declared that Mary was complicit in the murder of her husband, Lord Darnley. The casket letters were produced, to much amazement, but it should be noted that these letters are still debated today, and of course Mary would have argued that they were forgeries, but to English eyes they were authentic. Mary refused to put forward a defense if she was not allowed to make an appearance herself. Thus, Elizabeth was happily able to claim in 1569 that she could not pronounce a verdict, as Mary could not be found guilty without a defense. The matter technically remained in limbo, to the Scots' dismay, but it had the effect that Elizabeth had desired. Mary had been publicly disgraced and was moved to the shabby castle of Tutbury to begin her imprisonment. But this would not be the end of the Queen of Scots' story, and her future would unfortunately be a bloody and unfortunate one. (1567) had seen renewed civil conflict in France. The unsteady peace between Catholics and Huguenots in France, which was to allow for some religious toleration, boiled over yet again. The relations between England and France were also deteriorating, for the French were certain Elizabeth was aiding the Huguenots yet again. Mary, Queen of Scots' imprisonment only added to this deterioration of relations. Although the King of Spain, Philip II, had supported his former sister-in-law's ascension, he was beginning to have misgivings about aiding an open heretic. The relationship between these two realms began to deteriorate as well, and one of the main sources of contention that would arise between them was the activity in the Low Countries, i.e. the area around modern-day Netherlands and Belgium. Technically, the Low Countries were firmly in Philip's inheritance, but they had historically maintained a degree of autonomy from their ruler. They had their own group of powerful nobles, and although Catholicism remained as the main religion in the Low Countries, soon Protestant churches began springing up, in part due to French refugees fleeing their own country. Unfortunately for Philip, the regent that had been appointed in his absence soon lost control of the situation there and appealed to him for aid against the Protestants. In 1567, he sent a Spanish army to the area and began purging nobles, setting up what is known today as the Council of Troubles, aka the Council of Blood. This would be the beginning of what is known today as the 80 Years' War, aka the Dutch Revolt. The English publicly felt that Philip had every right to do what he pleased. These were part of his realms. But Elizabeth was undoubtedly worried by the actions of the Spanish. The Low Countries were a major source of trade for England, and if Philip exerted total control over the area, this trade could come under threat. Of course, there was resistance, with many Dutch incursions being led against the Spanish. A notable leader of one of these incursions was a noble by the name of William of Orange, also known as William the Silent, not to be confused with the William of Orange, future King of England. William of Orange will come up again throughout Elizabeth's story. In November 1568, some Spanish ships carrying a vast amount of treasure were forced by pirates to seek refuge in English harbors. The Spanish assumed that the treasure was being confiscated by the English, and that very well may have ended up being the case, but in reality no decision had been made with what to do with the treasure ships. Nevertheless, the Spanish seized English ships and eventually banned all trade with England from the Low Countries. This was the beginning of a major conflict between Spain and England, as Philip now began to give credence to his conscience and began contemplating taking action against Elizabeth for her heretical beliefs. However, Philip's leaders in the Low Countries convinced him that bringing the Low Countries under control must happen first before any action could be taken against England. Resentment was beginning to grow in England as well, not only by the merchant community who took a huge blow with the trade ban, but also members of the nobility, specifically the Duke of Norfolk, who formulated a personal vendetta against Cecil. He held that Cecil was responsible for many of the problems internationally, and was also responsible for the way Mary, Queen of Scots, was handled. It should be noted that although Mary had been publicly disgraced, many still held her in high esteem and were not happy about her treatment. Norfolk was not alone in this, and although Elizabeth would defend her secretary, she did realize that something needed to be done about the international relations. Thus, again, Elizabeth became open to putting Mary back on the Scottish throne. Norfolk, for his role, was now eager to pursue a marriage to Mary, Queen of Scots, which had been suggested to him some time before. Rumors began to circulate about this, But when Elizabeth confronted Norfolk about this, he deflected and refused to acknowledge this, although it was certainly true. The logic behind this was similar to the Dudley proposal, as Mary could be paired with a loyal Englishman who could keep her in check when she resumed her place as Queen of Scots. Mary, who was open to whoever could get her out of the current situation, was all for the match. Soon, many on the council were in favor of the marriage as well, but the Duke remained fearful of the Queen's reaction and so never discussed this with Elizabeth openly, despite her attempts to prod him into discussing the matter with her. Soon, Dudley broke and relayed all the information to the Queen. Although Elizabeth was privy in part to the idea, she was angered at how far things had gone. Norfolk was summoned to Elizabeth's presence and forced to confess his plans, with Elizabeth angrily chastising him for his behavior. All those who had previously supported the idea at court now shunned the Duke, and he soon left court. It was believed that with his departure, rebellion was on the horizon, and in reality, Norfolk was conspiring in such matters. But his courage, as was the case in the marriage discussions, failed him. He traveled to the Queen to submit, where he was arrested and moved to the Tower. Elizabeth was tempted to try Norfolk of treason, but he remained in the Tower. However, the events startled Elizabeth into thinking that she had lost control of affairs. Other northern earls who had been sympathetic to Norfolk were summoned against the advice of counselors. The reason the counselors objected to this was due to the fact that they believed that this would simply spur on rebellion that was trying to be avoided. This turned out to be true. The northern earls, coming from an area that the Queen did not have a tight grip on and had only begrudgingly accepted Protestant changes, assumed they would be deprived of their liberties and thus rose up given the circumstances. A rebel army began to march south in what is today known as the Rising of the North, or the Revolt of the Northern Earls, which used religion as their main grievance, allowing them to gather support as they went. Although this caused much worry in the south, the reality was that the rebel army was not well trained, and fewer northern barons joined the cause than was expected. By November, the army began retreating back north. The leading earls were forced to flee to Scotland, with only one, Thomas Percy, Earl of Northumberland, being eventually captured and executed. Elizabeth punished the North by allowing her representatives in the North to punish the common folk through martial law, and it was estimated that around 500 commoners were executed in the North during this time. To give context, Elizabeth's sister's persecution of Protestants totaled around 300 persons, and her executions of rebels related to Wyatt's rebellion was around 100. Elizabeth's father executed around 250 rebels for their role in the Pilgrimage of Grace rebellion during his reign, so it can be argued that Elizabeth's punishment was quite severe in the North. This has yet to account for executions of Catholics, which will be discussed shortly. In 1570, the leader of the Protestant Scottish nobility was assassinated, leaving it leaderless, and threatened by Mary's supporters. Elizabeth still had failed to acknowledge Mary's Protestant son James as King of Scotland, and still refused to do so. However, the French were threatening to take up Mary's cause unless she was restored, so again, Elizabeth had to tread lightly with both parties, that is, the Protestant Scottish party with young James as their king, and Mary's party with foreign rulers willing to back her and her supporters. Unfortunately, further dread was added to the situation when the new Pope, Pius V, formally excommunicated Elizabeth and declared that her subjects were no longer bound to her. Up to this point, Elizabeth did not consider the Catholics within her kingdom as enemies, and had been criticized by many for her soft treatment of them. She hoped that Catholicism would slowly die out in England, but the Pope had drawn the line in the sand. Her Catholic subjects were unfortunately required to choose between God or country. Elizabeth, remembering her experiences with the last Parliament, was hesitant to call another, for she feared that she would again be pressured on the issue of the succession. But not only did she need to tighten laws on the Catholics after her excommunication, but she also needed money, and thus, in April 1571, Parliament met. Anti-Catholic bills were introduced, which broadened the definition of treason, although Elizabeth did push back to limit some of the more strict legislation. This is something that will be returned to. Elizabeth had laid out the terms in which Mary could be restored to her crown in Scotland, but they were very intense ones, and included Mary converting to Protestantism. Mary actually accepted these terms, most likely with the intention of going back on her word once she was installed, but her son's representatives declined to accept this, giving Elizabeth a reason to claim that it was not her fault that these negotiations had fallen through. Mary, being exhausted with the whole matter, employed a Florentine banker named Roberto Ridolfi, someone who was sympathetic, even enthusiastic, towards Mary and the Catholic cause in England. He was actually in communication with the Pope and the Spanish, and was serious about seeing Elizabeth removed from her position. Mary communicated through Ridolfi that if Philip of Spain and the Pope were to free her, they could expect support from English nobility, and she of course was referring to the imprisoned Duke of Norfolk, who she was still open to marrying. The Duke was actually removed from the Tower and placed on house arrest, but did not feel that he was being prevented from continuing to court Mary. The Duke, however, wanted nothing to do with Mary's dealings with Ridolfi and the foreign powers. However, he did not want to completely repel Mary away from him, for he feared that Mary may then look for another husband. Thus, he did not take a hard stance per se against the measures and met with Ridolfi. The Duke refused to sign documents pledging his support to a Spanish invasion, but it was understood, probably incorrectly, by Ridolfi that the Duke was still on board with the enterprise. Philip of Spain, for his part, was all too ready to believe that the English subjects would rise up against a heretic queen, and thus a plan was hatched by the Spanish council in July 1571 that was to see a Spanish force sail from the Netherlands to depose Elizabeth and put Mary on the English throne. Soon word had reached Cecil, who had been recently made first Baron Burghley, that there was a prominent English noble who had traitorously given support to a foreign invasion, but who it was he was not yet aware. The traitor was only given the code name 40. Elizabeth, too, was unaware who could be plotting against her, but soon Cecil was hot on the Duke of Norfolk's trail, and when Norfolk's secretaries were questioned, they revealed information that incriminated the Duke. When the Duke's house in London was raided, incriminating ciphered letters were found between him and Mary Queen of Scots about Ridolfi. By September 1571, Norfolk was again sent to the Tower for his role in the quote-unquote Ridolfi plot, as it's known today. He was tried, convicted, and executed on Tower Hill, although not until June 1572, as Elizabeth was initially hesitant to execute him. Many, including Cecil, took the view that Mary Queen of Scots should suffer the same fate, but Elizabeth would still not relent in recognizing Mary's queen status. She was able to prevent Mary from being condemned, and from being worked out of the succession in Parliament that followed in the spring of 1572. But the Ridolfi plot exposed the degree to which the Spanish were willing to go to confront Elizabeth in England, and thus it was imperative to try and find some sort of alliance with the French. Not long before the Ridolfi plot, marriage discussions had begun with the French for a possible match between the 37-year-old Elizabeth and the 19-year-old at the time Duke of Anjou, Henry, the future King Henry III of France. This is not to be confused with his younger brother Francis, who was at the time Duke of Alençon, but would become the famous Duke of Anjou Elizabeth would interact with after his brother became king. Francis will be discussed in much more detail shortly, but at the time, in 1571, Charles IX was still alive, and the future Henry III was still Duke of Anjou. Charles IX of France and Archduke Charles of Austria had by now found wives for themselves, but Catherine de' Medici was thrilled at the idea that one of her younger sons might marry a queen. Henry, for his part, was less, if at all, enthusiastic about the match, and further problems arose when it was deemed that he would not be willing to convert from his Catholic faith. Obviously, the age difference was an issue as well, and by August 1571, the issue had been dropped. After the Spanish involvement in the Ridolfi plot, however, Elizabeth attempted to reignite these discussions. She made a huge concession in that she would allow Henry to practice his Catholic faith in private, something she had previously refused to compromise on. But Henry was still uninterested in the match and required that he be able to practice his faith in public. This, of course, was unacceptable, and the negotiations were halted, but Elizabeth could now at least show her subjects that she was truly putting forth an effort to find a husband. Catherine de' Medici was not so quick to let the discussions end. She put forward the name of another of her sons, the 16-year-old Francis, Duke of Alençon, who would eventually become Duke of Anjou in 1574 when his elder brother Charles IX died and his other elder brother became Henry III of France. It was said that Francis cared less about religion, and thus, despite his age, a fresh round of negotiations were in order. It was also good news that the French had become less inclined to champion Mary Queen of Scots after learning of her Spanish dealings in the Ridolfi plot. With Mary out of the picture, the defensive Treaty of Blois was concluded in April 1572, which provided that the two powers would come to each other's aid if the other was attacked by a foreign power. But unfortunately, incredible events were to take place in the Netherlands that would see the Treaty of Blois become almost worthless. William of Orange and his brother were recruiting mercenaries to make a push into the Low Countries, and it looked as if Charles IX of France would assist them. Elizabeth was prompted by some of her advisors to also take part in this endeavor, but she and Cecil worried about the temptation that might arise in France's eyes to take control of the area themselves, despite the new treaty that had been reached. Catherine de' Medici was concerned at her son Charles IX's actions, as aiding rebels in the Low Countries could be seen as a declaration of war on Philip and the Spanish. The leader of the Protestant Huguenots in France, a man named Admiral Gaspard de Coligny, was Charles IX's major influence on the matter. Catherine decided secretly that he should be eliminated in an attempt to prevent her son from taking part in threatening actions that could be construed by the Spanish as aggressive war moves. Thus, an assassination attempt was attempted. This injured Coligny, but failed to kill him. Not to be deterred, Catherine concocted a made-up story to her son, which accused the Huguenots of conspiring against the crown. She argued that all of the Huguenot leadership should be eliminated at the wedding of her daughter, who was being married to a man named Henry of Navarre, a Protestant who will come up again later. This wedding was to take place soon, and many of the leading Huguenots would be present. Charles believed his mother's story and agreed to the plot. Thus, on August 24th, 1572, the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre took place. Admiral Coligny and other Protestant nobles were killed in line with the plan, but unfortunately, the people of Paris, who were mostly Catholic, learned of what was happening and used this as an excuse to execute as many Protestants in the streets as they could get their hands on. From Paris, the bloodshed continued into the provinces, where more Protestants were executed. The new Pope, Gregory VIII, and Philip of Spain were overjoyed to hear the news of the slaughter, but of course, those in Protestant England were appalled. This was seen as proof by many that there was an international Catholic conspiracy to see Protestantism extinguished throughout Europe. Relations between England and France, unsurprisingly, took a step back. Technically, the two were still at peace with the Treaty of Blois, but the marriage negotiations with Francis, Duke of Alençon, were put on hold, although eventually the Huguenots that remained in France were able to make a defense, and peace was, for the time being, reinstated between the Huguenots and the French crown. However, in May 1574, Charles IX died, and he was succeeded by his brother, who became Henry III of France. This, as we remember, would eventually see Francis, Duke of Alençon, elevated to the position of Duke of Anjou, and he will be referred to as such moving forward. Henry III's marriage negotiations with Elizabeth, as we also remember, were called off due to his supposed serious dedication to Catholicism, so it was feared that he would be even more harsh on the Protestants in France. But Henry eventually confirmed the Treaty of Blois. His younger brother Francis, Duke of Anjou, escaped court and joined the Huguenot forces, but soon went back to his brother's side, and war between the two sides once again broke out when Henry III took away the Huguenots' rights to worship freely. Many tried to convince Elizabeth that she was now the one that had to come to the aid of the Protestants on the continent, but she was hesitant as always to start trouble with the French, who were technically her ally. But a fragile peace was once again reached for the time being. The St. Bartholomew's massacre had made some in England call for the head of Mary, Queen of Scots, in retribution for the terrible actions. The Civil War in Scotland had yet again broken out in 1573, but Mary's supporters were eliminated by the Scottish regent with financial support from Elizabeth, although Elizabeth maintained that her assistance was an isolated gesture. Ironically, the negative events in France led to a softening of relations between Spain and England for the time being. England could not afford to be on questionable terms with both superpowers, Spain and France, and thus sent word that they were open to peace. Philip was reluctant, but his leaders in the Netherlands convinced him that this was a good idea, as they desired that trade with the Low Countries could return and piracy of their ships could be limited. In March 1573, the Convention of Nijmegen and the Treaty of Bristol was concluded to see this take place. This laxing of hostile relations between England and Spain made Elizabeth even more reluctant to assist the rebels in the Netherlands, despite the religious undertone. William of Orange was forced to retreat, and Elizabeth formally recognized him as a rebel. Again, as was the case with the opposition to Mary Queen of Scots in Scotland, even though she may have had much to gain by allying with Protestant rebels in both realms, in reality, she deplored rebels standing up to kings and queens, even though the foreign kings and queens that the rebels were standing up to were many times hostile to her and a greater threat. By 1575, the rebels in the Low Countries were in dire straits, and William of Orange threatened to collude with the French if Elizabeth would not assist. He also offered to make her sovereign of the Low Countries if she would just throw her lot in with them. She denied this, but the disputes related to the Low Countries drove Elizabeth to near madness. The stress associated with these interactions and negotiation troubles caused her to lose her patience and temper often, and she was known to shut herself away at times. Despite urging from some of those around her, she remained unwilling to assist the rebels in the Netherlands. Luckily for the rebels, many of the provinces loyal to Philip decided it would be better to change over to the rebel cause after the underpaid Spanish troops' actions made their life unbearable. The 1576 Pacification of Ghent declared an alliance between the Low Country provinces to drive out Spanish influence. Unfortunately, this was not to last. In 1577, the Perpetual Edict was agreed to, which was to see Spanish troops removed, but loyalty to the Spanish crown and Catholicism to remain intact. William of Orange refused to be part of this, and in the end, the leaders of the pack would go back on their word. The peace lasted only a few months, and once again William of Orange emerged as the rebel leader in the Troubles. Unfortunately, factions began to develop, and the rebels were inflicted a defeat at the Battle of Gembloux. Elizabeth was again pressured to assist the rebels, but she only wished to send a German mercenary force at the time. This was not to be sufficient to the rebels, and thus they reached out to none other than Francis, Duke of Anjou/Alençon, to assist them. Elizabeth was fearful of this for the same reasons she had feared Charles IX assisting the rebels. She did not want any foreign power encroaching upon the Low Countries. Despite her attempts to prevent this, the States General of the Low Countries entered into an agreement with Francis in August 1578, which was to see him provide troops and return for an elaborate title. This would amount to nothing, as by the end of the year, Francis's incompetence had led him to being forced to retreat, but this goes to show how serious Elizabeth was about preventing any foreign influence in the area. The rebels continued to have military losses inflicted upon them, but Elizabeth remained obstinate and refused to send aid. Instead, she looked to Francis, Duke of Anjou, and again revived the marriage negotiations, hoping she could use him to assist the French Protestant Huguenots. Then this might convince Philip that peace was best in the Netherlands. In January 1579, Francis, Duke of Anjou's representative, landed in England. The negotiations were unsurprisingly unfruitful, as demands on both sides were unpalatable. Elizabeth also insisted on seeing her suitor in person. Francis agreed and landed secretly in England in 1579 himself. Elizabeth was enamored with the young man and nicknamed Francis her frog. Francis soon returned to France, but it seemed as though Elizabeth was finally ready to tie the knot. But by 1579, Elizabeth was 46, and although many in the realm were confident that she could still bear children, the reality was that it was unlikely at this point. The truth of the matter was that Francis was a Catholic and Frenchman, and this left many opposed to the match. The public pushed back, but despite this, Elizabeth continued to insist on the marriage. But when she found a cold response from her council, she tearfully and angrily realized that it was not to be. This feeling was exacerbated by news that her longtime favorite, Robert Dudley, had secretly taken a wife, Elizabeth's first cousin once removed, the Countess of Essex. Her husband, Walter, Earl of Essex, had died in Ireland serving Elizabeth. This family will come up again towards the end of Elizabeth's story. Elizabeth was understandably outraged, but little could be done, as nothing had been done criminally by Dudley. For the time being, he fell from her favor, but would eventually be restored to the Queen's grace over time. As always, business had to go on. At the beginning of 1580, Philip of Spain absorbed Portugal after the Portuguese king died, furthering Philip's power to English dismay. Francis, Duke of Anjou, had also been offered the sovereign title by the Low Countries if he assisted in repulsing the Spanish, to which he accepted via the Treaty of Plessis-les-Tours. This wasn't something, obviously, that the English wished to see either, but Elizabeth was more lenient as she was still set on pursuing Francis to a degree. In reality, the marriage negotiations were all a feign to keep relations somewhat positive between England and France, but for the most part, Elizabeth knew little could come of this. Francis, Duke of Anjou, was still confident that he could secure a marriage to her, however, and returned again a second time to England. Elizabeth was again, at least publicly, smitten with the young man. Incredibly, this time Elizabeth declared that she was indeed ready to marry. She offered Francis a ring, kissed him, and declared that she would be Francis's wife. But the fine print in what Elizabeth was expecting was completely unacceptable to the French, and again, Elizabeth looked to use this as an excuse that she was not the one who was being unreasonable. Francis refused to leave England without Elizabeth being his wife, causing Elizabeth great concern, but in the end, Francis relented and left England. This would be the last time any such interaction took place between the two. His leadership in the Netherlands did not go over well, and he died in June 1584. At this point, it is prudent to discuss an interesting English character and some adjacent events that were taking place. This man had been involved in a voyage to the New World, where he and his fellow soldiers were attacked and betrayed by Spanish sailors of the Spanish Armada, feigning peace. The Spanish and Portuguese had by this time laid claim to large areas in the Americas and were enforcing monopoly-type regulations that essentially ban any foreign power from sharing in the riches and opportunities there. The English, unsurprisingly, were one of those powers being cut out of the spoils, and soon pirating of Spanish ships became a major enterprise. Although this man was lucky to have escaped back to England after the Spanish attack, he would carry lifelong resentment for his experiences there and would always see the Spaniards as his natural enemy. This man's name was Francis Drake, and after his experiences with the Spanish overseas, he became dedicated to pillaging Spanish ships, eventually with Elizabeth's consent and investment into his practices. The English merchants were angered by Drake's actions, as they feared that trade with Spain would suffer, but Elizabeth remained supportive of him. Soon he became somewhat of a hero to the English, despite the criticism. Not only did his plunder aid Elizabeth at time, but his aggressiveness towards Spain also gave England a boost in morale in their disputes with the Spanish. Drake will come up again briefly throughout the rest of Elizabeth's story. It seemed as though Elizabeth had trouble around every corner, but soon the issue of religion and the Queen of Scots would take a drastic turn. By the late 1570s, it was becoming clear that Catholicism was not slowly dying out, as had been hoped by Elizabeth, but instead it was seeing a resurgence. Additionally, the Catholics had limited leadership and remained a somewhat disorganized group. That is, until the appearance of the Jesuits in England. The Jesuits would assist the English secular priests organization and would assist in spreading them throughout the kingdom. They were also instrumental in assisting the priests in finding refuge from persecution, though the Jesuits would always remain a minority in England. The persecution and execution of Catholics had by that time already began, with Cuthbert Maine being the first to be executed for treason, being hanged, drawn, and quartered, but this did not have the desired effect of suppressing the faith. Thus, by 1581, the Catholic threat was becoming seriously worrisome. New bills were introduced in Parliament, which would eventually culminate in the famous Act to Retain the Queen's Majesty's subjects in their due obedience, aka the Religion Act of 1580. This made it treason to persuade someone to withdraw their allegiance from the Queen by converting to Catholicism. Harsher monetary punishments were also incurred by those who continued to hear Mass or failed to attend Anglican services. Although this was clearly suppression of religious dissidents, this was slightly different than what had happened in Elizabeth's sister's reign. Her sister, who is known today as Bloody Mary for her persecution of Protestants, executed her subjects under the laws of heresy against the Church, whereas Elizabeth simply brought religious affairs within the secular realm and executed her subjects for treason. Thus, Elizabeth was able to somewhat escape the negative stigma that was often associated with religious persecution. This did not mean that the Catholics suffered any less. Torture was used regularly on priests, and the executions themselves were frighteningly ghastly affairs. Although Elizabeth had worked hard to try to separate religion and treason to a degree, this in reality proved to be impossible, and in the end, the people could see what was really afoot, for over 180 Catholic priests were executed during Elizabeth's time as queen. Unfortunately for Elizabeth, the persecution and martyrdom of priests only caused inspiration, and thus recusant numbers continued to rise. Of course, there was still the concern of Mary Queen of Scots, a potential Catholic figurehead for rebellion in England if there ever was one. For a time, it seemed that Mary had settled down in her captivity and was willing to wait until Elizabeth passed away in order to hopefully take her place as Queen of England. But eventually she grew tired of waiting, and plots again began to arise from the imprisoned queen. A new factor that would soon come to the forefront was that her son James was nearing his majority, and it was cause for concern that he would look unfavorably on his mother's imprisonment. James, of course, was a Protestant, but no solace could be taken from this fact alone. James actually had begun to fall under the influence of French Catholic family members and had communicated positively with his mother in captivity, but eventually he was seized by a group of Protestants known as the Lords Enterprisers in order to prevent the grasp of the French Catholics over James from growing too strong. He would eventually escape from the Lords Enterprisers' grasp, but the communications with his mother would not continue in the direction they had previously. In reality, he never knew his mother well and was not particularly close to her. The previous conversation he had had with her, which had explored a potential joint monarchy with her, were only in the name of self-preservation, and in fact, James was now starting to experience some true power in his own right, and he would, of course, be reluctant to relinquish this. Nevertheless, in addition to the Scottish tensions, there was still a lingering uneasiness about potential Catholic foreign invasion of England. Soon a plot known as the Throckmorton Plot was discovered, which showed that the Duke of Guise in France was in the process of planning an invasion of England in order to put Mary Queen of Scots on the English throne. Although it appeared that Henry III of France was unaware of this endeavor, the Spanish had shown themselves to be clearly involved, and thus relations were severely impacted. The Spanish ambassador was, in fact, kicked out of England as a result of the plot. Mary remained a problem, and after the talks with her son came to nothing, she was again looking to foreign powers to help secure her release and ascension to the English crown. Assassination became a worry for Elizabeth as in 1584, William of Orange, the important leader of the resistance in the Low Countries, was assassinated by a Catholic assassin. Therefore, it became clear that something needed to be done to prevent this happening in England. In October 1584, Cecil produced a document to the council known as the Bond of Association. This essentially stated that if any person was found to be the beneficiary of a plot to depose Elizabeth in favor of themselves, they would automatically be barred from the succession and executed. This was clearly aimed at Mary and her supporters, and thus, if a plot was discovered that was intended to put Mary on the throne, she could be disbarred and executed. This bill passed in Parliament, although the part of the bill that looked to take action against James as well if a plot was discovered was scrapped, as Elizabeth did not wish to take a stance against James as well. The death of William of Orange and the Duke of Anjou left the rebels in the Netherlands in an unorganized and dire situation. They again offered the sovereignty to Elizabeth in 1585, but she again would have none of this. Nevertheless, someone had to defend the rebels in this situation, and it was becoming clear that it would be the English that would have to be the ones to take on this role. Ghent and Antwerp fell, and shortly thereafter, the Treaty of Nonsuch was signed, which was to see an English army sent to the Low Countries led by Robert Dudley, Earl of Leicester. Dudley sailed to the Netherlands in December 1585, but just as historic incursion on the continent had showed in the past, the endeavor on the continent proved to be a costly and corrupted affair. Nor was Dudley able to gain much in the form of progress, eventually leading him to return to England to be next to the Queen, who very much missed his presence. Of course, others wished to see him return for a more serious issue, the Queen of Scots yet again. Elizabeth had taken steps to make sure that Mary was more secure in her confinement and moved her to Chartley. A plan was devised to attempt to control Mary's correspondence secretly, and thus a double agent was utilized to make Mary believe that she was having secret correspondence with the outside world. In reality, all of her communication was being reviewed by the English, and it was in these circumstances that something known as the Babington Plot came to light, named after one of its chief conspirators, Anthony Babington. In the plot, Elizabeth was to be assassinated, and Mary was to be put on the throne in her place. Babington wrote to Mary to bring her up to speed in the matter, and she gave her consent to the plot against Elizabeth. Babington and his accomplices were arrested and executed in September 1585, being executed as traitors and suffering particularly gruesome executions. A hearing for Mary was set at Fotheringhay Castle, where commissioners soon arrived to try the Queen of Scots for her role. She unsurprisingly was found to be guilty and sentenced to death, but convincing Elizabeth to sign Mary's death warrant was another story. Parliament petitioned her that Mary should be put to death, but as was the case with the Duke of Norfolk years prior, Elizabeth hesitated in the matter. International outcry was a serious possibility, and though Elizabeth knew that Mary would always be a threat to her, she did not wish to stir the international pot and give any foreign nation an excuse to start up serious hostilities. James of Scotland was of course a source of worry, for Mary had become somewhat of a popular individual in Scotland, despite her prior detestation due to her involvement with her husband's murder. James was under pressure to defend his mother from death, but Elizabeth did have confidence that James would not jeopardize his chances of inheriting the English throne by declaring war if his mother was executed. In the end, despite Elizabeth's reservations, she signed the death warrant demanding that Mary be executed in the hall of Fotheringhay rather than the courtyard. Elizabeth continued to search for another way out of the situation and searched for someone to assassinate Mary quietly. This way, she could argue that Mary had died of natural causes and thus would not bring the international uproar that may arise. This would also prevent her from having to execute another anointed monarch, for we must remember that there was a degree of self-preservation involved with protecting Mary. In the end, this was not to be, and Mary was executed on February 8, 1587. Elizabeth was, of course, frenzied when news reached her and tried to place the blame elsewhere, as there was indeed international uproar about the execution. But in the end, Elizabeth bears just as much, if not all, of the responsibility as anyone else involved in the process. Mary was buried with full honor, although her final resting place is something that will be discussed at the end of Elizabeth's story. Although the main beneficiary of a Catholic rebellion in England may have been eliminated, the threat of Catholicism internationally was still very real. The situation in the Low Countries remained dire, and word was flowing in that Philip and the Spanish were preparing for war. Despite the lack of all-out aggression between Spain and England in the past, Philip had always remained angered by what was taking place religion-wise in England. Drake and English privateers, along with the English army that had been sent to the Netherlands, had added fuel to this fire, and although his military commitments elsewhere may have prevented him from taking action sooner, by 1585 he was ready to make his move and began planning to invade England. He hoped this would be viewed as a crusade against a heretic Queen Elizabeth. He was supplied two separate plans by two of his leading nobles and decided to attempt to form a kind of hybrid between these two plans. The first was meant to land in Ireland and draw forces from the mainland of England to Ireland, leaving the mainland open to attack. And the second was meant to take the mainland by surprise by taking the Spanish army in the Netherlands across the channel under the cover of darkness. Philip also had a distant claim to the English throne which he was keen to put forward. The new Pope Sixtus V partially financed the endeavor and agreed that if conquest was successful, Philip could designate who he deemed fit as new ruler of England as long as Catholicism was restored. To add further dread to the situation, in 1584, Philip had concluded the Treaty of Joinville with the Guises in France. This was meant to ensure that if Henry III of France, who had no sons and now no living brothers, died, the Duke of Guise would do everything in his power to prevent the Protestant heir, Henry of Navarre, from taking the French throne. After the Duke of Guise called Catholics to arms in what is known today as the Catholic League, Henry III of France was forced to submit to the anti-English Duke. The Huguenots were again not tolerated in France, and Henry of Navarre was barred from the succession. Civil war, unsurprisingly, again broke out between the Guises and Henry of Navarre's supporters. Philip set about readying his armies and fleets, and news traveled fast that a major offensive was imminent. Spies were able to pick up on the plans and relay them back to England. Although Elizabeth had reservations about provoking Philip further, she agreed that something must be done, and so, therefore, in 1587, commissioned Francis Drake to sail with a small fleet to Spain to attack the ships that were being readied in the harbors. On April 19, 1587, Drake sailed to Cadiz harbor and laid waste to the ships that were there. He then captured Cape St. Vincent and attacked Spanish ships that were in close proximity. He was able to return with great treasure, and the overall voyage was a resounding success, especially since it played a part in Philip being forced to delay implementing his plans from the autumn to the spring of the following year. Philip's plan would be altered again when he decided that there would be no landing in Ireland. Instead, the Spanish Armada would sail to the English Channel and anchor, while the Spanish army in the Netherlands was ferried across the channel protected by the Armada. By 1588, Pope Sixtus issued a new excommunication against Elizabeth, which was circulated in the Low Countries, and new writings were put out to urge English subjects to rise up in favor of the Spanish when the time came. In July 1588, the Spanish Armada was on their way to England. England had not sat by idly while the Spanish preparations were taking place. The English Navy was readied and had been modernized and expanded. The ship designs had been altered to be less wide and more maneuverable, which would become a very important factor in the upcoming battles. A week after setting sail, the Armada was spotted off the Cornish coast. The initial skirmishes were uneventful, and the English were keen to keep out of range of the Spanish grappling hooks, which was one of their greatest weapons. The hooks would typically have been used to mount enemy ships and take them over once on board, but the maneuverability of the English ships proved to be too much to the Spaniards' dismay and amazement. Additionally, the Spanish army in the Netherlands was not able to depart according to Philip's plan, not only due to bad weather, but also due to limitations of water depth, which would leave the army vulnerable until they were out to sea. After the Spanish Armada had anchored off of Calais to wait for the army of the Netherlands to emerge, the English struck. Some of the ships in the English fleet were converted into fire ships, being stuffed with flammable material and set ablaze. These ships were sent towards the Spanish ships at midnight in hopes that, in the confusion, the Spanish ships would pick up anchor and flee in confusion. This plan worked, and in a panicked and unorganized manner they set out to sea. The next morning, reinforced with fresh ships, the English now had the advantage. In what was to become known the Battle of Gravelines, the English, while making sure to stay out of grappling hook range, utilized their faster reloading cannons and better ship maneuverability to unleash a debilitating attack on the scattered Spanish fleet. The wind changed, allowing the remaining Armada ships to flee north with the English giving pursuit. In the end, they were forced to let the remaining Spanish ships go. Nevertheless, the battered Spanish ships would be hard-pressed to survive the journey back to Spain, and indeed, this was to prove disastrous for them. They would be forced to sail north of Scotland, and supplies ran dangerously thin. Off the coast of Ireland, storms wrecked many ships, causing thousands of deaths due to drowning and executions by the Irish. In July, Elizabeth was invited to inspect the troops at Tilbury, where she gave her famous speech while wearing a breastplate over her dress. When word reached England of the losses that the Armada had incurred, jubilation spread throughout the country. Elizabeth, unfortunately, was less jubilant, as she had unfortunately experienced a great loss at this time. Her longtime flirtatious favorite and suitor, the Earl of Leicester, Robert Dudley, died in September 1588. He was able to write one last letter to the Queen before his death, which Elizabeth cherished to the end of her life. Elizabeth had stood up to the might of the Spanish Armada and to the international Catholic threats that threatened England's very existence. It was time for the final, chaotic chapter of Elizabeth's long and eventful life. Since we have discussed the death of Elizabeth's favorite, Robert Dudley, it is time to bring to the forefront two of the last major characters in Elizabeth's story. The first was Dudley's stepson, an attractive, elegant, educated, and charismatic young man named Robert Devereux, Earl of Essex. As we recall, his mother had married Robert Dudley after his father had died in Ireland. He was high-born and well-connected lineage-wise. However, his father had all but destroyed any type of family wealth while in Ireland, and thus he was not particularly financially wealthy. With Devereux, Elizabeth expected a similar type of relationship that she had had with Devereux's stepfather Dudley. She assumed that if she elevated this young man and showed him favor to the point of bringing him great wealth and honor, He would completely and utterly be dedicated to her as she was the sole reason for his elevation. With Dudley, this had certainly been the case, but she would soon find out that Devereux was quite different from his stepfather. Devereux had actually been part of his stepfather's campaign to the Netherlands and had also subsequently succeeded him as the master of the horse, once Dudley had been elevated further. By 1587, he was already in great favor with Elizabeth, and the death of Dudley only furthered this. However, unlike his stepfather, Devereux would find submitting to Elizabeth's royal will difficult, not only due to the fact that he was beloved by the English people, but also due to his personal relationship with the Queen. His ability to flatter Elizabeth and change her attitude towards him when she was upset with him led him to believe that he would be able to get away with virtually anything. However, as we will shortly see, this would be far from reality. Additionally, despite Elizabeth's woes in relation to her favorites being despised by many previously, she didn't necessarily take kindly to Devereux being so loved by the public, as this made controlling the young man much more difficult. Devereux would prove himself, despite the favor and forgiveness shown to him time and time again, to be a childish and immature fool in his public dealings with the Queen. The second individual that needs introduction is William Cecil's second son, Robert Cecil. Robert Cecil was almost the antithesis of Robert Devereux, Earl of Essex. He was physically damaged and short, having suffered an injury in his youth, and was geared more towards schooling and statecraft. His father had taken him under his wing and had taught him much about the intricacies of politics and diplomacy. He was a detail-oriented, smart, and witty individual who was apt not only in business, but also in his dealing with people. Devereux and Robert Cecil would not get on well and would eventually develop a serious rivalry, despite the fact that Robert Cecil's father, Lord Burleigh, had taken on Devereux's guardianship after Devereux's father died. Devereux would refuse to show Robert Cecil respect, and although he would still show respect to Robert's father, Lord Burleigh, the right-hand man to the Queen and his former guardian, he would eventually begin to show that he did not believe that he needed Burleigh's assistance to rise through the ranks of politics. Thus, it would eventually come to be that Lord Burleigh would actively hinder Devereux's progression when possible, in hopes of protecting and promoting the prospects of his own son, Robert Cecil. Robert would eventually be made secretary, against the protestations of Devereux, who wanted one of his own to be installed into the position, although this would not happen until 1596. However, both Robert Cecil and Robert Devereux would be made councillors, and Elizabeth still held both in high regard individually. After the victory over the Spanish Armada, Elizabeth was eager to follow up with an offensive against the Spaniards. It was assumed that all the ships that survived would reassemble once reaching Spain or Portugal. The offensive was planned to, first and foremost, finish off the remainder of the Armada, before turning to potentially landing in Portugal to spur an uprising and or attacking treasure ships for plunder. Elizabeth was clear that the Armada ships must be handled first before attention was turned elsewhere. However, the leaders of the expedition, including Francis Drake, disregarded the Queen's requests and took heavy casualties. To add to her anger, her favorite Devereux had secretly left court to partake in this expedition himself. Upon returning in failure, Drake was demoted and would not be trusted by Elizabeth for years to come. For the time being, Spain was put on hold, for the situation in France was becoming unstable. As we remember, the French Duke of Guise, the leader of the Catholic League, had forced the French King Henry III to cede to his demands, which included barring the Protestant Huguenot heir, Henry of Navarre, from the French throne. However, once the Spanish Armada had been defeated by the English, Henry III felt inclined to stand up to the Duke of Guise and had him assassinated. The Catholic League was outraged and swore vengeance on Henry III. Thus, Henry reconciled with his former heir, the Protestant Huguenot Henry of Navarre, and the two joined forces to combat the Catholic League. By 1589, they were besieging Paris when Henry III was assassinated by a Dominican friar and partisan of the Catholic League named Jacques Clement. Thus, the Protestant Henry of Navarre succeeded Henry III as Henry IV of France. Of course, the Catholic League did not recognize him as king, and he lost some support of the moderate Catholics who had supported Henry III. Additionally, he was in financial turmoil and desperately needed aid. Despite requests from the new French king for said aid, Elizabeth, in her typical fashion, remained hesitant to commit her forces and assets to the struggle. but she also could not afford to have the country overran by the Spanish, for fear that France would be used as a springboard to attack England. Thus, she did end up sending some troops and money to France in order to aid in the fighting against the Catholic League. With this assistance, Henry IV was able to gain ground against his enemies and was posed to defeat the League, but Henry also remained quite ungrateful and difficult to work with. Unfortunately, in 1590, the Spanish also physically committed troops to their side of the war effort, which included landing troops to occupy parts of Brittany. England was forced to defend the majority of this area on its own after Henry IV failed to hold up his end of the bargain to send troops there as well. Elizabeth decided that she would again send troops to aid Henry IV in his attempt to lay siege to Rouen in Normandy. The Earl of Essex, Robert Devereux, was chosen to lead the expedition, but after arriving, the English army was forced to stand by after Henry IV again failed to hold up his end of the bargain by pursuing other objectives that suited him better at the time. Devereux eventually returned to England without success after men and money had been wasted uselessly outside Rouen. Henry IV's situation was still dire, and once it became clear that Elizabeth and the English would not aid him any further in his fight with the Catholic League, he decided to eliminate the one thing that caused so many of the French populace to despise him: his faith. In July 1593, Henry IV converted to Catholicism, but unsurprisingly, re-implemented the toleration that had been extended to the Huguenots in years past. This had the desired effect, and Henry was reconciled for the most part with his subjects. The war with Spain, however, continued, with the English pushing the Spanish out of Brittany in 1594. But issues at home in England remained concerning as well, with the repulsion of the Spanish Armada and subsequent raids, along with the war effort in the Netherlands and France. Finances were becoming incredibly tight. Harvests and food shortages in the 1590s did not help matters, and there still remained an underground religious threat from the more radical Puritan Protestants. The Puritans attempted to have their way in Parliament, but were prevented from doing so by Elizabeth and the powers that be. Thus, what is known today as the Marprelate controversy began. An anonymous author, going by the name Martin Marprelate, began circulating tracts satirically attacking the episcopacy, aka the bishops. Elizabeth was outraged by this, and she became dedicated to tracking down the culprits. The press printers were eventually caught and tortured, but refused to give the name of the anonymous Martin Marprelate. Although he may have never been caught, these writings did serious damage to the Puritan cause by lowering the esteem of the Puritan community, and also by exposing the underground Puritan community to the English government. This underground movement was effectively destroyed, and by 1593, the Queen was successful in her defeat of Puritanism domestically. By 1595, a new offensive was planned against Spain with the Dutch Navy. This was to be led again by Elizabeth's spoiled favorite, Robert Devereux, and others, after Sir Francis Drake had died in January 1596. The fleet left in June 1596 and successfully captured Cadiz, destroying and capturing some of Philip's Spanish warships. Devereux returned to England more of a hero than he had ever been before, and this surged his confidence and arrogance. He began to regularly disagree with Elizabeth about an array of things, including the placement of certain men into certain positions. When Elizabeth refused to listen to Devereux's protestations, he would often leave or threaten to leave court, which surprisingly would cause Elizabeth to attempt to compromise the situation or calm him down. She could not stand to be at odds with her favorite, and he played his cards knowing this to be true. But resentment was indeed beginning to grow in Elizabeth's mind. In October 1596, what is known today as the Second Spanish Armada again sailed with the intention of landing in Ireland. But a storm destroyed many ships, causing them to return to port. The English were keen on striking while the Armada was recouping, and an expedition against the Spanish was again planned, with the Dutch offering aid as well. Yet again, Devereux was named as the commander in 1597, and in July the expedition set out. It was forced to return due to storms, and again went out in August of that year. It was agreed that after the Spanish fleet was dealt with, Devereux would be able to attempt to attack Philip's treasure ships. Devereux decided against the first part of this plan and sailed for the Azores Islands. The island's voyage, as it is sometimes referred to today, was a disaster, as Devereux was more focused on gaining wealth from plunder than engaging the Spanish ships. Additionally, He proved to be inept at positioning himself to intercept the treasure fleet and missed them while they were carrying £3.5 million worth of treasure. By the time Devereux headed home after the failed islands voyage, the Third Spanish Armada was already on its way to England, ready to easily intercept and destroy them. In a stroke of luck, the Spaniards were again grieved by storms, and Devereux and his ships were able to return to England safely. However, Elizabeth was concerned and angered that her kingdom had been almost taken off guard, and she held Devereux personally responsible for this. Never again would she attempt such an endeavor, and to add insult to injury, Henry IV of France concluded the Peace of Vervins, which essentially took France out of the war. Elizabeth could of course sue for peace with the Spanish, but she could not afford to abandon the Dutch and their plight against Spain. Philip II of Spain died in September 1598 and was succeeded by his son, Philip III. The war with Spain continued under this new leadership. However, things were not well between Elizabeth and her favorite. In heated discussion with the Queen about the war, Devereux turned his back on the Queen, causing her to cuff him on the ear. In turn, Devereux grasped his sword in a tense and unprecedented standoff. Although the sword was not drawn, the damage had astonishingly been done. Devereux, in his typical fashion, stormed off and retired to his country estates. William Cecil, Lord Burleigh, died while Devereux was away at the age of 78. He had never retired and remained dedicated to his queen to the end. Elizabeth was unsurprisingly distraught at his death and took the news poorly. Devereux saw an opportunity with Cecil's death and did not wish to remain absent while opportunities existed at court. He hoped that if he took a role in the dreaded Ireland, he could again mend the broken bonds that had been shattered by the sword incident. Elizabeth refused to grant him an audience, but after Devereux feigned illness, he was again allowed access to the Queen. Although Devereux believed that he had again wooed himself back into the Queen's favor, in reality, Elizabeth remained much more guarded against her favorite. Ireland still granted him opportunity to prove himself greatly to her, as after the island had risen in revolt, an army was required to make sure that a foreign power could not overtake it. Devereux was granted the leadership position he desired, and he set off from London amidst crowds of cheering onlookers. Ireland was a lawless and despised place at the time, with many Englishmen considering the people of the island savage and ungovernable. Historically, the civilian population suffered greatly from the reprisals of previous rebellions, and this only strengthened the disdain between the two islands. Previously, Elizabeth had looked to be conciliatory with the Irish rebels, but given the situation, she was in no mood for negotiation and would settle for nothing less than the destruction of the rebel cause in Ireland. When Devereux landed in Ireland, he realized that despite the great army and resources given to him, the guerrilla tactics that were being used by the Irish rebels were incredibly effective. Devereux dilly-dallied around for many weeks to Elizabeth's annoyance, as she had expected him to confront the rebels immediately. Although she continued to push him to confront the rebels, he instead incredibly agreed to private talks with the rebel leader. A truce was agreed, and Devereux and his army withdrew to Dublin. After he informed Elizabeth of the truce via letter, he returned to England without permission in order to personally confront Elizabeth about her anger from the situation and the perceived injustice that he believed was being extended to him on account of Robert Cecil's counsel. Once reaching England, he traveled quickly to London, where he then traveled to court, going all the way to the Queen's bedchamber unannounced. He barged in before Elizabeth even had time to dress properly. Elizabeth, taken aback, feared the worst, that Devereux had formally rebelled and could be in the presence of an armed contingent. Due to this, she remained composed in her speaking with him until she could confirm that a rebellion was not afoot. By the time she realized that a rebellion was not at hand, she berated him for his behavior and failures in Ireland. He was then intensely interrogated by the council and confined to his room before eventually being put on house arrest. Public opinion was in his favor, and many thought that Robert Cecil had been the agent who had swayed the Queen against Devereux, who they believed was being treated unfairly. This put Elizabeth in an awkward position she had not been in before, as none of her previous favorites were held in such high regard publicly. Devereux was eventually stripped of all of his offices, with the exception of the Master of the Horse, and allowed to return to his own residence. He was forced to remain away from court, and Elizabeth decided to not renew his monopoly on sweet wines, which essentially took away the heart of his financial income. Rebellion had always been in the back of Devereux's mind, but with this indignity, he was sure that his favor could never be redeemed. Devereux attempted to befriend James VI of Scotland and convince the Northern King that Cecil was to blame for his downfall. Not only that, he succeeded in convincing James that Cecil was bent on keeping him from the English throne, although there was no truth to this. James was unsurprisingly open to assisting Devereux should he need his assistance. Plans were formulated, which was to include Devereux seizing control of Elizabeth and forcing her to call a parliament to move against Cecil and the other enemies of Devereux. He had now committed himself to full-blown rebellion and treason for that matter. Word of the action leaked and he was summoned before the council. This, unsurprisingly, spurred him into action. Essex Rebellion, as it would become known, began on February 8, 1601, when councillors sent to again deliver a summons to Devereux were imprisoned at his house. He marched on London, assuming that he would gain massive support along the way, but he found that very few were willing to step up for him, and when the Queen called her loyal citizens to arms, they sided with her. Devereux found that he had been publicly deemed a traitor in London. Finding little support, he boarded ships, abandoning his supporters, and rode back to his residence. Soon the house was surrounded, and Devereux was forced to submit to the Queen's forces. He was duly tried, found guilty, and sentenced to death. He was executed by beheading on February 25, 1601, at 35 years of age. Despite his treasonous activity, he was still widely loved, and many still believed that he had been wrongfully executed. Thus, hatred of Robert Cecil intensified and continued. As it was, Elizabeth found herself without her favorites and in difficult financial situations as she aged. This caused her to be less generous at court and caused her to also tighten down financially. As she grew older, many of her courtiers found themselves in difficult financial situations as well, racking up debt and struggling to keep up with rising costs. The court became rife with poverty, corruption, and bribery. Elizabeth began granting monopolies to some of her courtiers, but unsurprisingly, this was to the detriment of those who were not beneficiaries of this, and she was soon forced to repeal them. Unfortunately, this financial strife and harsh environment tarnished Elizabeth's reputation with many of those around her at the time. Many began to realize that it would indeed be Mary, Queen of Scots' son, King James VI of Scotland, who would be deemed as heir to the throne, and this thought was welcome to many. The Queen soon became prone to bouts of depression after Essex Rebellion, and was now more prone to bursts of anger. Despite this, she continued on progress through the kingdom, something she had enjoyed throughout her life. What was known as the 9 Years' War in Ireland, which Devereux had failed so miserably at, continued on, although after the Spanish landed troops in Ireland in 1601, the siege of Kinsale and the subsequent battle all but defeated the leading Irish chieftain at the time and forced the Spanish to return to Spain. The question of succession, of course, was on everyone's mind, although it remained a taboo subject to discuss. James VI of Scotland was the obvious choice, but Elizabeth would never officially acknowledge his claim, as she remained suspicious of him to the end of her life. Robert Cecil, however, was not inclined to sit around and wait, and was proactive in his communication with James. Of course, this came as a surprise to James, who had been duped by Devereux into believing that Cecil would do everything to keep him off the English throne. Nevertheless, the two began communicating, and Cecil was able to provide James with proper advice on how to handle Elizabeth, going as far as drafting James' communication with Elizabeth. This worked, and the relationship between Elizabeth and James improved greatly because of it. Of course, Cecil's motivation cannot be ignored. He was positioning himself to be successful in the next reign, and indeed, James made it clear that he would reward Cecil for his service in this capacity. Some argue that Elizabeth was probably aware of what was going on between Cecil and James, and may not have been surprised. Christmas 1602 was particularly joyous and festive for Elizabeth and those around her, but by February 1603, a deep depression set in for the Queen. This was the beginning of the end. She did not eat or sleep, and refused to take any remedies prescribed by the physicians around her. For many hours she sat silent and motionless on cushions spread out in her chamber, and refused to get up or lie in her bed. By March, she was finally coaxed into her bed. She soon lost the power of speech and laid on her side, while prayers were read aloud for her. She showed signs of joy when the Archbishop of Canterbury, John Whitgift, came to kneel at her bedside to pray. She refused to let the old man stand, despite his old age and difficulty kneeling. Thus, the Archbishop remained on his knees next to her where she wanted him, until, in the early hours on March 24th, 1603, the glorious Virgin Queen, Elizabeth I of England, slipped into unconsciousness and died. She was 69 years old. Her will was never completed, but by this time, it was clear that James would be the next in line to inherit the throne. By 10 a.m. that morning, James had been proclaimed as king in London. With all the preparations and celebrations that came with the new monarch, Elizabeth's body lay somewhat forgotten at Richmond for some time before being given an understandably magnificent funeral at the end of April. She, the last Tudor monarch of England, was to be laid to rest in the crypt beside her grandfather, Henry VII, the first Tudor monarch of England. But Elizabeth's story in death does not quite end there. James, after becoming king, would end up moving Elizabeth's body in 1606 after he constructed a white marble monument in the north aisle of Henry VII's chapel. She was laid to rest on top of her nemesis in early life, her half-sister Mary. James then in 1612 had his mother, Mary Queen of Scots, moved from her resting place at Peterborough Cathedral to Westminster Abbey and placed in the opposite aisle of Elizabeth, but made sure to make the tomb canopy taller for his mother than the one that was made for Elizabeth. These tombs can still be seen at Westminster Abbey to this day. The incredible reign of Queen Elizabeth I is one of the more intriguing and interesting reigns to learn about. The downfall and execution of her mother set a bloody stage early in her life for the outrageous and incredible events that were to take place as she grew. Danger seemed to lurk at every turn from the beginning of her life right through the very end. In her youth, life taught her harsh and valuable lessons in the brutal world of politics and public life in the 16th century. One must not forget the dangerous and questionable interactions she endured with Thomas Seymour and the troublesome and anxious relationship with her half-sister Mary, which in both cases could have ended her career or perhaps even her life before it had a chance to blossom. She learned great lessons from these chaotic experiences and would use these lessons to grow into a shrewd and clever young woman, confident in her abilities and rights. After becoming queen, she was faced with an array of troubling predicaments and again faced enemies almost everywhere she turned. The Scots in the north, whose public interaction with Elizabeth would eventually come to be dominated or perhaps even overshadowed by her tumultuous relationship with the Queen of Scots. The Irish to the west, where rebelling chieftains made the international threat even greater than before. The succession of French kings to the south that each presented new and difficult individual challenges to overcome under the blanket of religious civil war in the country. The popes in Rome, who were intent on seeing Elizabeth overthrown in favor of a Catholic ruler, and at last, her former brother-in-law, Philip II of Spain, whose detestation of her perceived heresy never wavered to the end of his life. Of course, one must also not forget the dangers that existed domestically as well, with religion and the succession issue creating a threatening undertone in her interactions with her subjects, of which resentment was most likely inevitable. Not only did she face a threat from the conservative Catholics in England, but due to her central position on many issues in religion, she simultaneously faced criticism and threats from the more radical Puritan Protestants as well, leaving little room for mistakes. Despite this, she was able to utilize practical policy and harsh penalties to declare victory over both groups in the end. She was also in an almost unwinnable position with regards to the succession, for her sister's experiences before her had shown that there was clearly serious danger that existed in a marriage for a ruling queen. Naming or having a clear successor had also proven to be equally dangerous to many rulers in the past, and thus one can perhaps at least begin to grasp the gravity of the situation she was forced to deal with and understand why she handled it the way she did. Despite the danger, the lessons learned from her youth gave her confidence to cope with the issues at hand. She was elegant in speech, confident in tone, and used her virginity and sovereignty to gain the love and respect of her subjects. By keeping international leaders and those closest to her constantly guessing, she was able to remain in a state of controlled limbo that allowed her to many times achieve what it was she was seeking. This also often prevented her from having to take responsibility in certain scenarios. On the other hand, she is not without criticism. The very indecisiveness that allowed her these benefits also led to detrimental effects in other areas, whether that was the demoralization of troops, limited patronage to courtiers, or a deterioration in international relations. Her inability to clearly and authoritatively make a decision on a major scale and remain confident in that decision was not always something of benefit to her or the people around her. There is also nothing to say that if she had died suddenly when she was younger, when someone like Mary Queen of Scots still lived, that the civil war and strife that so many feared would not have become a reality. We must also not forget that Elizabeth could be particularly brutal in the reprisals and punishments that she handed out. Although her sister is today remembered as Bloody Mary, indeed Elizabeth was no less apt to deal in blood than her Tudor predecessors. Her reaction after the rebellion in the north was undeniably harsh, and the Catholic suppression and executions are seen by many today as similar, if not worse than, the actions of her elder sister against Protestants. Although it can be argued that Elizabeth initially attempted to prevent or forestall Catholic bloodshed, the choice to move against them when the threat to her became clear must be attributed to her approval, whether advised on the matter or not. Torture was indeed used during her reign, but one must be careful not to view this through the lens of modern-day moral values, and instead view this through the lens of 16th century politics. Nevertheless, despite her shortcomings, Elizabeth's accomplishments are great. She restored Protestantism throughout England, defeated the Spanish Armada, stood up to foreign kings and popes, remained dedicated to her people, and succeeded in ruling over a mostly stable and united kingdom throughout her reign. This seems to have cemented her position near the top of not only the short line of famous Tudor monarchs, but also in the long line of English monarchs as a whole. For today, she is still remembered as Elizabeth, England's glorious Virgin Queen.